Chapter 2022. The mirror didn't care about them at all. At this moment, it was like it had turned into a black hole, producing a suction force that even the 8 universe emperors couldn't resist at all. Under this suction force, the 8 universe emperors felt an indescribable existence start to rapidly leave their bodies and fly towards the mirror. As this indescribable existence continuously left their bodies, the 8 universe emperors felt that the supreme, eternal, and indestructible realm that was originally so close to them seemed to be getting further and further away from them. The feeling of being forced down from their peak made the 8 universe emperors feel an indescribable sense of fear and hatred. "Who the hell is it?" they roared one after another. Their roars resounded throughout the entire universe, entering the ears of all living beings in the universe, causing them to be extremely shocked. They had no idea what kind of shocking change had happened to cause the 8 universe emperors to suddenly become like this. At this moment, within the copper mirror, a curled-up figure gradually materialized from nothingness, gradually appearing in the mist. The figure quietly laid there, hugging its knees with its back arched like a bow. It looked like a fetus in its mother's womb. As the incomparably mysterious existence from the 8 universe emperors continuously poured into the mirror, the figure became clearer and clearer. It also became more and more solid. At the same time, the entire world started to tremble slightly. Vaguely, there seemed to be all sorts of indescribable things gathering towards the mirror from all directions, constantly pouring into it and fusing into the figure. This caused the speed at which the figure solidified to become even faster. The 8 great cosmos emperors had spent so many years to reach this step, but this mirror had only taken a few days to reach this stage. It had directly forced them back to the time when they were first born. It even caused their bodies to gradually collapse at this moment, gradually dissipating into the world, producing all sorts of incomparably sacred, incomparably beautiful, and even incomparably mysterious phenomena. If it wasn't for the horrified roars of the 8 universe emperors, perhaps the living beings in this world would have thought that this was a phenomenon that would inevitably appear when the 8 of them became saints. But at this moment, those living beings were only filled with terror and astonishment, because, combined with that roar and the current scene, they could tell that this was a sign that the cultivation bases of the 8 universe great emperors were collapsing. Due to the collapse of their cultivation bases, the 8 universe emperors were unable to control the power that they could control as they pleased. In the end, the power had no choice but to leave their bodies and dissipate into the surroundings. Because of this, it created all sorts of indescribable phenomena around the 8 universe emperors. This scene caused the countless living beings in this world to gradually form a psychological shadow in their hearts. That was, when they rose to the level of these 8 universe emperors, they would inevitably walk towards destruction and destruction. One could imagine that after this, the cultivation world of this world would definitely suffer a heavy blow. At least, at the false saint level and above, all cultivators would definitely be filled with anticipation and fear towards the cultivation of the great emperor of the universe. As expected, he's made his move. At this moment, a sigh that no living being could hear came from the depths of the 13 demon god races. The 13 demon god races were formed from the 13 sages, but this didn't mean that they had completely abandoned everything. In reality, the 13 sages still had a bit of clarity and a bit of will left to sense everything in this world. In other words, their bodies and everything else were obeying the cycle of reincarnation in this world. But after that, they still had a bit of consciousness that was watching everything unfold. They could sense how much of the boundless negative karma that originally existed in their bodies had been whittled away by the demon god race that they had transformed into. That's right. The most fundamental reason why the 13 sages had transformed into the demon god races was to wear away the endless karma that existed in their bodies. The karma of heaven and earth had appeared because they had obstructed the growth of the 2 worlds. Under such circumstances, The best way to eliminate the karma of heaven and earth was to use one's everything to make up for the world and help it grow. Through this, one could obtain endless merit of heaven and earth and finally neutralize the karma of heaven and earth, allowing them to regain their freedom and step into the sage realm again. Of course, there was just too much negative karma. By transforming into 13 fiend celestial races and using another method to help the heaven and earth evolve and grow, they were indeed able to obtain quite a bit of merit each time and neutralize quite a bit of negative karma. However, at this speed, they would need at least 1 trillion cosmic wars before they had a chance of completely neutralizing all the negative karma. Even these sages couldn't ignore this speed. All along, although the 13 sages had been paying attention to the development of the situation in this universe, they had actually been constantly looking forward to the birth of this scene today. The 8 sages who had schemed against the 13 of them were unlucky. Now that they saw him, all of them were gloating over his misfortune, but they were also extremely vigilant. They were naturally gloating because the essence of the 8 sages had been extracted and taken away. As for being extremely vigilant, there was no need to talk about it. They were worried that what the 8 sages had experienced would happen to them at some point. Fortunately, the development of the situation didn't quickly develop to the point where the 13 sages felt despair. Just as the 8 sages lost their bodies and power, and even their essence was greatly damaged, the suction produced by the mirror gradually disappeared. At this moment, the strange phenomena that kept appearing around the 8 emperors, the terrifying power that kept leaking out, they gradually dissipated. Along with them dissipated, the 8 emperors also disappeared. From then on, no traces of their existence could be found in this universe. It was as if the 8 of them had never appeared in the first place. The emperors have died? Some cultivators murmured. Their expressions were filled with disbelief. They were filled with disbelief. One must know that the 8 emperors could originally be called the strongest, noblest, and most inconceivable existences in the entire universe. To the countless living beings in the universe, the 8 of them were the strongest protectors, as well as the strongest shackles. Not only did they make the living beings in the universe feel safe, but they also constantly attacked their enthusiasm for cultivation. This caused the hearts of countless living beings to be shackled by the traces of the 8 emperors' power. Under such circumstances, the sudden disappearance of the 8 emperors caused the living beings to be at a loss for a moment. However, very soon, they didn't need to choose, because a new change had already occurred. At this moment, the mirror that had absorbed the mysterious existence from the 8 emperors suddenly began to violently tremble. The figure that was curled up inside the mirror, like a mother in a womb, began to gradually stretch its body. It was like a newborn baby that was beginning to explore the outside world for the first time. At this moment, this figure had already become incomparably clear. It was impressively Luofan's appearance. "You've finally condensed a bit of your will." A voice that seemed to come from the deepest depths of the mist came from the figure. Then, Luofan's figure flickered, and his figure appeared outside the copper mirror, which was also his half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. That's right, the one here was indeed Luofan, whose body had been brazenly shattered and turned into a world. To be more precise, it was a bit of his will. Luofan looked at the vast and boundless starry sky in front of him. Memories of how the 2 worlds had fought over the countless trillions of years, how they had evolved, and how they had finally condensed flashed through his mind. These countless trillions of years of memories contained an endless amount of information. Normally speaking, even if it was Luofan's main body, it would take him hundreds of millions of years to completely sort out all this information. He even had to be extremely careful in the process. Otherwise, the slightest mistake could cause his body to explode from the information. But at this moment, the bit of will that was here did not feel the slightest bit of strain. In fact, with just a thought, when he wanted to understand the countless memories, those memories had already directly appeared in his mind and directly integrated into his memories. The entire process was so smooth that it was beyond common sense. It was as if these memories had originally been in his heart. However, when he thought about how this world came to be, perhaps he could understand why this situation was like this. After all, this world was evolved from everything he had. Even if the world evolved from the other baleful aura was fundamentally different, after being devoured, its essence had changed and become a part of this world evolved from his body. In this way, everything that happened here naturally happened to him. It was not wrong to say that all the memories were originally in his heart. Luckily, I have a treasure. Otherwise, I'm afraid I really would have died this time. After understanding the endless memories, Luo Fan suddenly felt incomparably lucky. As he spoke, he lightly waved his hand, and the half-step primordial origin spirit treasure entered his body, fusing with him. As this treasure fused with him, his body suddenly emitted an indescribable aura. The bit of illusion that originally existed had completely disappeared in the blink of an eye. What replaced it was an unimaginable reality and stability, a reality and stability that surpassed the entire world. In fact, during these countless trillions of years, he had been in a daze. His own will had been completely integrated into the world, constantly reincarnating with all things in the world. If there was no accident, his will would become independent in this reincarnation. In the end, it would be impossible for his will to fuse again. He would truly become all the living beings in this world. At that time, as Luo Fan's existence, naturally, it would be equivalent to death, and his soul would scatter. This was also one of the calamities of this time's calamities. Fortunately, he had this half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. Even though his fourth tribulation contained limitless power and could easily shatter everything he had and open up a new world for himself, it was impossible for him to do so. But this did not mean it could completely destroy this half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. In fact, under that punch, although this half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure seemed to have been shattered along with Luo Fan and turned into all the living beings in this world, that was only the appearance. As a half-step primordial origin spirit treasure, its innate essence was eternal and indestructible. It wasn't something that could be erased so easily. At that time, this half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure seemed to have been scattered into countless fragments. It seemed to have evolved into all the living beings in this world, but its essence still did not change from beginning to end. In other words, it was just that the originally complete copper mirror had turned into countless fragments. In essence, it was still a half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. As long as Luo Fan thought about it, it could naturally condense and turn into a complete half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. It was also because of this that the will that Luo Fan placed in this half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure was able to maintain its essence. In order to maintain his consciousness, he used the essence of the saint that was condensed from the achievement of the saint, which could fight against the heavens and earth, to finally awaken that bit of his will, which led to the current scene. As for the various schemes from before, although they were related to him, it was more because his own essence affected the nature of the world. It had little to do with his own will. In other words, all of this was actually the result of the natural operation of the world. It was fundamentally different from what the 13 sages thought that he was scheming behind the scenes. As for why he had to rely on the moment when the 8 universe emperors became sages to absorb the essence of the sages, there was no need to explain. This was because at other times, the essence of the 8 sages was eternally stable. Even if he had the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure, he could not shake it at all. Only at the moment when they became sages, when the essence of the sage was quickly born, could there be a way to absorb this essence before it was stable. This was also the only reason why the process of the 8 universe emperors becoming sages failed. Luo Fan's will took form in the void. His realm was still close to the level of a fourth tribulation powerhouse like his main body. However, in this world, he had an indescribable sense of nobility and power. It was as if any living thing in this world, even if it was a saint, could not pose any threat to him. They could not truly hurt him at all. The reason for this was very simple. It was because this expanse of the world was practically formed by him. Everything in this world, including the sages, actually belonged to him. Under such circumstances, if the sages wanted to attack him, wouldn't it be like a part of a person's body wanting to attack him? As long as he did not want to commit suicide, he would subconsciously hold back, and it would be impossible for him to be fatally injured because of this. When he stood in the void, his presence naturally spread throughout the entire universe. This made all living beings in this world clearly know that an extremely noble existence had appeared in this world. For a moment, everyone was at a loss, but the uneasiness in their hearts had already unknowingly decreased by a lot. I have to recondense all the concepts of my existence. Luo Fan naturally did not pay too much attention to the changes in everyone's emotions. At this moment, he was only thinking about how to get through this tribulation. Compared to the previous few tribulations, this one was special from the beginning. In the previous tribulations that he had encountered, the attacks usually went from weak to strong. Only towards the end of the tribulations would the attacks become stronger. However, this time's tribulations were completely different. In this tribulation, he had suffered a terrifying attack that was far beyond the peak of the previous tribulations. Even now, when he thought of that punch, he was still shocked beyond words. He even suspected that it was a punch from someone who had surpassed the true divine level. After all, even if it was a true saint attacking, he could still feel the mysteries within it. However, he could not see through the mysteries of that fist at all. He actually felt that it was just an ordinary punch from an ordinary person. After that, the tribulations made him try his best to escape from the consequences caused by that punch and try his best to come back to life in the scene caused by that punch. The entire process was almost the complete opposite of the previous tribulations. No matter how one looked at it, it could only be said to be strange. All sorts of thoughts flashed through his mind. Luo Fan raised his eyes and looked at the ancestral lands of the 13 demon god clans. At this moment, his eyes penetrated countless obstacles, illuminated endless space-time, crossed the infinite laws, and directly saw the 13 sages hidden in the 13 ancestral lands. Or rather, it was the remnant will of the 13 sages. Chapter 2023. Looks like we've reached the end? One of the sages sighed and said. Hearing his words, the other sages also revealed an inexplicable expression. They seemed to be a little regretful and unwilling. After all, they were all sages. Even if they were already afraid, they wouldn't lose their composure. You're the cancer of this world, Luo Fan said lightly. His words were transmitted into the depths of the ancestral lands of the 13 fiend celestial races and into the ears of the 13 saints. It caused their minds to tremble, causing them to suddenly feel as though the entire world was suppressing them and repelling them. It was as though they could not wait for them to die immediately. What a high level of authority! The 13 sages had the same thought. With this thought, the 13 of them each took action. As sages, they naturally couldn't lose their will to resist just because of words. They couldn't surrender just because they felt that the opponent was stronger than them. At this moment, the 13 of them had already thrown all their previous plans to the back of their minds. At this moment, their sage's essence began to vibrate and began to resonate with all the power they emitted. Then, they slowly withdrew their own power. As they withdrew their own power, the living beings in the ancestral lands of the 13 demon god clans began to collapse, turning into the purest power and quickly gathering towards them. In a short while, the embryonic forms of 13 sages' bodies were constructed. During this process, the laws of the entire world began to tremble violently. Huge tribulation clouds condensed in the void of the universe, covering the ancestral lands of the 13 demon god clans. Waves of extremely terrifying pressure began to emit from the tribulation clouds, suppressing the 13 regions. It suppressed the 13 sages in the 13 regions. If the 13 sages were in the same state as before, their own power would be helping the world perfect itself. In this way, it would be equivalent to atoning for their crimes by performing meritorious deed. Although they had endless negative karma, the world wouldn't do anything to them. However, at this moment, when they condensed their own power again and constructed their sages' bodies, it was as if they had directly given up the opportunity to atone for their crimes by performing meritorious deeds. How could the world let them off? Naturally, tribulation clouds appeared. These tribulation clouds were condensed from almost all the destructive power in the world. The power itself was so terrifying that it had reached an unimaginable level. Even if these sages were in peak condition, they would not be able to hold on for long, not to mention that they had only barely condensed the body of a sage. Their original strength was not even 1/100th of their original strength. At that moment, the 13 sages felt a strong sense of life-or-death crisis shrouding their minds, causing them to tremble instinctively. This kind of trembling was something that even their sage wills could not suppress. At this moment, the 13 of them knew very well that if they didn't take action and waited a little longer, they would all die. He would no longer have the chance to attack. Understanding this, the 13 of them let out a soft cry, completely ignoring the tribulation clouds that hung high above their heads. Each of them launched their strongest attacks at Luo Fan's location. These sages were all in different shapes and forms, so naturally, their attacking methods were also different. These were the most powerful attacks they could unleash. Some were fists, some were palms, some were magic treasures, some were rays of light, some were air currents, and some were physical objects. But, no matter what kind of attack, they were definitely at the level of a saint. Under these kinds of attacks, the rules and laws in this part of the world seemed to be constantly rubbed by an invisible hand, becoming extremely chaotic. And that spacetime. During this process, it began to become extremely chaotic. All of a sudden, it was kneaded into a ball, and in the blink of an eye, it turned into countless pieces. In the blink of an eye, it seemed to be randomly glued together again. The chaos and strangeness of the scene had reached an unimaginable level. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. If this part of the world was only at the level of a perfect world, then even he could only escape in the face of such an attack. After all, although these sages were not real sages, they were not much different from real sages in this tribulation. Under such circumstances, even if one could completely condense the power of the entire world, it would not be able to resist their strongest attack. In fact, not only could it not be resisted, but even this part of the world would be completely destroyed by their strongest attack. Under such circumstances, how could Luo Fan, whose realm was not comparable to that of the 13 sages, resist it? However, it was obvious that this part of the world was not only at the level of a perfect world. After the world formed by Luo Fan devoured the world formed by the baleful aura, this part of the world had surpassed its limit and reached the level of a great world. Because he had surpassed the level of a great world, Luo Fan, who could almost control this part of the world like he controlled his own body, could naturally erupt with even more terrifying power, which was enough to resist the attacks of the 13 sages. At this moment, rays of mysterious light condensed in the void and condensed into 13 rays of spiritual light in front of Luo Fan. They split into 13 directions and charged forward. The 13 directions were all different. Under normal circumstances, it was impossible for them to come into contact with the attacks of the 13 sages. However, it was obvious that the mysteries contained in the mysterious light were enough to offset the different directions. At this moment, in a flash, it had already crossed space-time and collided with the 13 attacks. There was no sound, but at this moment the whole world seemed to shake. In the starry sky of the universe, the stars and the void around the 13 battlefields were instantly destroyed. In the blink of an eye, nearly half of the whole world had collapsed. All the living beings, all the stars, and all the matter were completely annihilated. Not even dust could be formed. The starry sky had completely disappeared at the same time. It was unknown how many worlds and spacetimes there were. Countless strange things were born from the impact caused by the collision. This was simply like the 13 battlefields, as if the 13 gods of creation were splitting the world apart. The countless worlds kept piling up and rolled out in all directions like sand. It seemed as if it was going to completely devour and replace the whole world. At this moment, this part of the world suddenly shook, and an endless amount of mysterious power was produced from everywhere in this world. It began to quickly gather towards the 13 shock waves, gradually annihilating the many worlds, spacetimes, and other indescribable things. At the same time, waves of black aura gathered above the heads of the 13 sages, causing the 13 retribution clouds to become bigger and darker. The pressure they emitted became even more intense. The retribution clouds were born from the karma of the world. The 13 sages had destroyed more than half of the spacetime in the world. It went without saying how strong the negative karma that was triggered was. How could such karma not strengthen the tribulation that the 13 sages were facing? In the end, Luo Fan's 13 spiritual lights couldn't destroy the sages' attacks and then rushed towards the sages' bodies. At this moment, the 13 rays of spiritual light had already disappeared along with the attacks of the 13 sages. In the blink of an eye, it was as if they had completely ceased to exist. Facing such a change, the 13 sages were about to attack again. Unfortunately, at this moment, the retribution clouds in the sky had already reacted. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning that seemed to distort the spacetime in the area around the retribution clouds was completely separated from the outside world. It looked as if it was a completely different world. The bolt of lightning was as black as ink. As soon as it appeared, the bodies of the 13 sages began to collapse. As for the spacetime, it began to distort crazily. The past, present, and future began to interweave in a strange manner under the lightning, forming a strange scene that could not be described with words. The lightning was obviously trying to erase the past, present, and future of the sages at the same time. Endless power erupted from the bodies of the 13 sages. Infinite mysterious light, spiritual light, airflow, power, rules, laws, and so on began to erupt from their bodies. While they continued to condense all kinds of indescribable defenses, they also produced all kinds of shocking destructive power that went against the lightning. Unfortunately, all of this had no effect on the lightning at all. These bolts of lightning seemed to have broken through layers of illusions and landed easily on the bodies of the 13 sages. As the lightning landed, the bodies of the 13 sages trembled. Regardless of which body they were in, their past, present, or future began to collapse. Immediately after, their souls, their sage powers, their sage essence, and even their concept of existence began to collapse at this moment. In a short span of a breath, the 13 sages had completely disappeared as if they had never appeared. The retribution clouds began to gradually dissipate. As the 13 locations returned to their normal state of clarity, the 13 ancestral lands of the demon god race had completely disappeared. 13 completely empty areas appeared out of thin air. At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if his entire body had become light. It was as if a heavy weight that had been pressing down on his heart had disappeared. The rare feeling of relaxation made him involuntarily reveal an inexplicable smile. However, he did not maintain such a smile for too long. His mind instantly transcended reality and directly broke into the conceptual level. At this moment, the conceptual level was not completely calm. There, countless concepts began to surge wildly. Countless existence concept fragments seemed to be like waves, constantly attacking all the concepts within his sensing range. He did not even need to identify them to know that the wave of concept fragments seemed to be one wave, but was actually divided into 13 waves. These 13 waves of concept fragments formed 13 waves of waves, constantly attacking in all directions and gradually merging with the countless surrounding concepts, and the concepts that were merged with these concept fragments would undergo some subtle changes while growing tremendously. If this change was transmitted to the real level, it would naturally cause those existences to directly forget all the memories related to the 13 sages, and even forget all the memories related to the 13 demon god races. This was the result of the retribution clouds completely destroying all their past, present, and future. Seeing this, Luo Fan did not dare to be negligent at this moment. With a thought, a weak concept of existence appeared in the conceptual plane like a ball. This existence concept was not something else. It was the existence concept corresponding to his consciousness. Compared to his overall existence concept, this concept was naturally insignificant. Naturally, it was extremely insignificant. Normally speaking, a slight tremble from his complete concept of existence would be enough to crush this weak concept of existence. However, at this moment, this existence concept was already his everything. After this existence concept appeared, it naturally emitted some kind of indescribable wave, directly controlling the endless surrounding concept. The endless concepts that were under his control began to change the way they welcomed the concept fragment. Previously, these concepts constantly devoured the concept fragments and completely integrated them into their bodies, causing them to constantly grow and transform. However, at this moment, following Luo Fan's thoughts, the way these concepts welcomed the concept fragments had changed. In other words, after devouring the concept fragments into their bodies, they released some other concept fragments in another direction at the same time. Concept fragments constantly collided into them. Concept fragments were constantly being blasted out. The concept fragments that were replaced seemed to be subjected to some kind of indescribable suction force. They began to quickly gather towards the spherical existence concept, perfectly integrating into it. As a result, the concept of the sphere's existence began to continuously strengthen. The whole process was extremely smooth. It felt as if these concept fragments were originally a part of this spherical existence concept. It really works. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. This concept fragment that had been replaced from those concepts was none other than his own concept of existence. In other words, after he endured that punch, his body split into that world and merged with the concept of existence in that world, and the concept of existence that was shattered by that punch, as more and more concept fragments merged into the sphere. Luo Fan felt that his spirit was becoming more and more complete, his own existence itself. His existence itself was also becoming more and more complete. Of course, this was just a feeling. In the real world, his consciousness was still a consciousness, and it did not give birth to anything like flesh and blood. In fact, he did not intend to let his consciousness give birth to flesh and blood so quickly. After all, flesh and blood were insignificant to existences at his level. As long as his concept of existence was intact, his body, his mind, his soul, and even his life essence could be restored at any time, without any damage. Under such circumstances, what was the point of building his own body bit by bit now? In contrast, wouldn't it be better to use this kind of energy to strengthen the replacement effect of the countless existence concepts? As for why he knew that his existence concept had already integrated with everything in this world, he didn't directly devour those concepts. Instead, he used this replacement method to extract his own existence concept. The reason was also very simple. Because after his concept fragments integrated with the concept of everything in this world, after countless years of evolution, they had derived new concepts and new essences. In other words, they were no longer pure to him, and those concepts were no longer completely his existence concept. Under such circumstances, if he were to completely devour the concept of existence of everything in this world, then it would obviously weaken his sense of self, causing him to gradually become not himself anymore. This was obviously unacceptable to him. Under such circumstances, replacing his own existence concept with other concepts was also the best and easiest choice. Those concept fragments were transformed from the existence concept of the sage. Such a concept fragment was extremely high in nature, even higher than Luo Fan's existence concept. At such a height, when these concepts of existence fused with other concepts, they would naturally have a huge impact on that concept, causing every point of that concept of existence to tremble. Only by erupting with the strongest power could the concept of existence be able to completely devour it and fuse with it. In this way, the fragments of Luo Fan's own existence concept would naturally be slightly separated from the other parts of the concept. Then, with the help of the special connection between the concept of existence and the other concept of existence, the attraction was triggered, and the slightly separated concept of existence could naturally be extracted. This was the fundamental principle of the entire replacement process. The existence concepts of the 13 sages were vast and infinite, and the number of them was beyond the limit that could be described by numbers. The high level of their essence had reached an unimaginable level. Even under normal circumstances, without Luo Fan's intervention, it would probably take hundreds of millions of years to completely integrate with the other concepts. Chapter 2024. Although there were occasional twists and turns in the process of fusing the concept fragments, it was still smooth on the whole. Phoenix update fast please search. After all, the root of the countless concepts around him still originated from him. For him, who could advance his mind to the concept level, these countless concepts were clearly within his control. Obviously, for the project of replacing concept fragments, the real difficulty was obviously to separate the fragment of one's own concept of existence from the other derived concept. In other words, it was to control the concept with such convenience. Some trouble would arise during the process. However, it was ultimately not too big of a trouble, and it would naturally not cause any real impact on him. In Luo Fan's perception, time began to gradually pass. Unknowingly, tens of millions of years had passed. During these tens of millions of years, he did not rest for a single moment. He was constantly replacing countless concept fragments and constantly condensing his own concept of existence. After tens of millions of years, the concept he replaced had unknowingly reached a level that was completely incomparable to before. At this moment, on the conceptual level, the concept corresponding to his original concept of existence had grown to a level that was completely incomparable to before. In this conceptual level, a huge and solid sphere was like a planet in the starry sky. Although it was small, it had an eternal charm, as if nothing could break it and nothing could shake it. Around this concept, the countless concept fragments formed by the 13 sages' concept of existence were like smoke that wrapped around his concept of existence. As it rotated slightly, it constantly swallowed the surrounding concept of existence. After a round of cleansing, it was sent away from the other side of the sphere. In this process, the concepts that were swallowed were completely changed, and the part that belonged to Luo Fan had been stripped away. It had fused into the sphere. It's the end. Suddenly, a kind of enlightenment appeared in Luo Fan's mind. As long as he could replace a piece of his concept of existence, then the concept that belonged to him would instantly break through a certain boundary. This concept of existence that belonged to him would instantly break through a certain boundary, and his instinct to pursue perfection would truly erupt, giving rise to unimaginable power. At that time, this power would easily shatter the boundless concepts in the surroundings and completely strip out the concept fragments that belonged to him. All of them were retracted. At this moment, he felt an indescribable pressure acting on his concept of existence. This pressure came from the boundless concepts around him, and it also came from the concept fragments that wrapped around his concept of existence like smoke at this moment. This is the resistance of heaven and earth. At this moment, Luo Fan had already understood what this oppression was. If he crushed all the surrounding concepts to retrieve his own concept fragments, all the existences corresponding to these concepts would be destroyed in an instant. In other words, the world where his will was, which was almost at the level of a great world, would completely collapse in that instant. It was completely destroyed. Not even a trace of it could be left behind. Such a change could be said to be a change that could destroy heaven and earth. In the face of such an outcome, how could this world sit back and do nothing? It was only natural for it to resist. No matter what, I must retrieve my concept of existence. With such a thought flashing in his mind, Luo Fan's will became incomparably firm, and he directly exerted his most powerful means. He began to carry out the last concept fragment replacement. The moment he took action, the concept of the infinite existences around him instantly changed. All the concepts in his head were completely out of his control in an instant. It was as if all of a sudden, all the concepts seemed to have obtained their own lives, and they began to resist all external forces. In order to replace the concept fragments, one needed to have a strong control over the concept itself. Now that these concepts had broken away from his control and obtained independence, this prerequisite naturally no longer existed. In this case, how could he complete the concept fragment replacement? This was a change on the level of concept. In reality, the change was even more intense. In the blink of an eye, all the rules and laws in this world exerted their power. Endless power was stimulated from all the space-time in this world, and gathered around Luo Fan's will in an incomparably mysterious way. With a slight tremble, his will completely collapsed. Even the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure that had suppressed his will and allowed his will to exist completely shattered into countless fragments. Under the impact of the rules and laws, the fragments spread throughout the world in the blink of an eye and were directly devoured by this world. Luo Fan didn't pay attention to all these changes. It wasn't that he couldn't sense it, but he didn't think there was any problem. A primordial essence spirit treasure, even if it was only a half-step primordial essence spirit treasure, still possessed all sorts of unimaginable mysteries. This kind of change that would be fatal to an ordinary magic treasure was really nothing to a magic treasure of this level. It could even be said to be an ordinary change in form. If he could withstand this wave of tribulations, he could directly gather all the fragments back with a thought. At that time, he would be a complete half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. Even if he couldn't withstand this wave of tribulations, the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure would still continue to gather under its own instinct. In the end, after hundreds of millions of years, it would naturally condense into a half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. In fact, it wasn't just the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure that had such a special characteristic. Even the connate inextinguishable spiritual light and other existences of the same level were the same. Otherwise, how could the innate inextinguishable spirit light, which had always been hidden in Luo Fan's body, disappear along with his body again and reappear with his body again and again? Wasn't it also because the connate inextinguishable spiritual light also had the special characteristic that no matter how it collapsed or was damaged, it wouldn't cause any harm to itself? Seriously speaking, it was only a change in form. Under such circumstances, how could Luo Fan care about the collapse of the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure? Wouldn't it be better to use his energy on the concept level to resist the wave of tribulations that was coming from the concept level? On the concept level, at this moment the entire sea of concepts began to surge. Endless concepts began to combine in various ways. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into a boundless sea of thunder and lightning. In the sea of thunder composed of such concepts, every concept had changed its original nature, and had produced some kind of change with other concepts that even Luo Fan could not understand, forming some kind of pressure on him that he could not have imagined before. How is this possible? At this moment, this was the only thought in Luo Fan's mind. The change in front of him had almost subverted his view of the world. This was not the reality level, but the concept level. In fact, according to the concept of an ordinary creature, an ordinary cultivator, it didn't exist at all. If Luo Fan hadn't thoroughly understood the essence of the concept in the tribulations, he might not have been able to discover the existence of this concept level with his current cultivation realm. However, on such a conceptual level that could almost be said to not exist, there were all sorts of strange changes that could only be developed on a display level. How could he stay calm? The concept of existence can actually give rise to such changes. Sensing the sea of thunder and lightning in the concept level, Luo Fan felt endless inspiration emerging in his heart. Endless inspiration gushed out from the depths of his heart like a mountain torrent, and his own concept of existence was also violently shaking. At first glance, it seemed that he was afraid of the sea of thunder and lightning and began to tremble under the pressure of the sea of thunder and lightning. The concept in the concept level was different from the concept that Luo Fan had condensed in the imperfect world. Back then, what he had condensed was merely a concept within that perfect world. In fact, it was similar to a rule that transcended the rule of law. It was precisely because of this. Only in that world could the various concepts be condensed into spiritual light and could they be transformed into various realms. In contrast, the concept that Luo Fan had advanced into was completely different. The foundation of this concept level was actually the concept of existence. Or rather, it was the materialization of existence itself. This was a completely different concept from the divine abilities and powers that had been condensed to the extreme. The reason why it was also called a concept was that Luo Fan didn't have the foresight when he named it. It was also because this was the essence of the concept level that Luo Fan was so shocked by the change in the concept level. To use a more understandable analogy, the change in front of him was like the characteristic of the hardness of metal itself that could actually make obscene jokes. This situation, no matter how one looked at it, was beyond common sense. However, for Luo Fan, what he cultivated was the worldview. Something that could almost shatter his worldview was the most beneficial stimulation for him. It was enough to make his worldview grow by leaps and bounds. Therefore, after recovering from the shock, endless inspiration erupted from his heart. At this moment, the sea of lightning had already begun to produce attacks. A huge lightning dragon rushed out from the depths of the sea of lightning. It charged straight at Luo Fan's concept of existence, which was the ball, with a destructive stance. In the air, the lightning dragon twisted crazily. Its claws and fangs flew everywhere, and its body twisted. In the process, it had almost exhausted the limits of its technique. Every move was enough to produce a destructive power that was hundreds of millions of times greater than normal. After the impact, the surrounding sea of lightning could not recover for a long time. It left behind an incomparably mysterious trajectory, which directly pointed at the ball corresponding to Luo Fan's concept of existence. At this moment, facing such a change, Luo Fan's heart trembled. An indescribable power was born from his concept of existence itself. It was an incomparably wonderful magic power. This kind of magic power seemed to exist and not exist. It seemed to be condensed from a certain concept of existence, but it also seemed to be a kind of illusion, an illusory product. However, it was this kind of magic power that exuded an aura that completely belonged to the worldview of laws. With such an aura, this magic power was obviously the Dharma power of laws. Moreover, with such a special characteristic, it was obviously the Dharma power of laws that could only be formed at the conceptual level. After this Dharma power of laws was born, it condensed slightly and formed a huge fist that rushed out of the ball. It directly hit the head of the lightning dragon. The lightning dragon's every move had exhausted the limits of its technique, but it clearly hadn't reached the limit that Luo Fan could deal with. The fist seemed to be without any technique and seemed to be just going straight, but it was not something that the lightning dragon could dodge at all. It was not something that Luo Fan could resist. All the power was poured into the lightning dragon's body without reservation. Following this change, the lightning dragon began to collapse rapidly. Violent shock waves were released from the lightning dragon's body, stirring the surrounding sea of lightning more and more violently, giving birth to all kinds of incomprehensible lights and shadows. At this time, the fist formed by the Dharma power of laws at the conceptual level also began to collapse gradually. Finally, when it collapsed to only half of its original size, it barely stopped and formed a new palm. This palm was half the size of the original. It stretched forward and pierced straight into the thundercloud formed by the lightning dragon's explosion. It constantly trembled and shattered the thundercloud, causing the fragments to gradually lose their original form of lightning and transform back into the state of the concept of existence. Then, under the grasp of the giant hand, bits and pieces of the concept of existence broke away from the concept of existence and rushed straight towards Luo Fan's concept of existence. Obviously, these were the concept fragments of existence. They were the fragments of Luo Fan's concept of existence. Such a fragment was much smaller than the concept fragments that he had been constantly replacing for tens of millions of years. It could be said that, normally speaking, it was much smaller. It could be said that, under normal circumstances, it would probably take tens of millions of fragments of this size to be comparable to the fragments that he had replaced in the past. It went without saying how low the efficiency was, but Luo Fan's expression was quite calm at this time. He wasn't the slightest bit impatient or discouraged. Being able to extract his concept of existence meant that success was in sight. In comparison, so what if the extraction speed was too slow? For him, even 100 trillion years was no different from an instant. How could he not have this bit of patience when there was no tribulation urging him? Just as the Dharma power of laws at the conceptual level fought with the lightning dragon, or rather, slaughtered the lightning dragon, his spherical concept of existence also began to gradually distort and squirm. Vaguely, it had already started to lose its original spherical shape and was gradually transforming into another shape. Of course, this transformation didn't damage the strength of the concept of existence at all, nor did it damage its ability to withstand external pressure. However, this transformation was fundamentally different from the transformation before it could form a sphere. If one had to make an analogy, perhaps the difference between the two was similar to the instinctive transformation of a plasticine creature that could change its form at will and the transformation of a creature that cultivated into a demon. Previously, before the power condensed into the world view of the world of laws, the unstable form was like the instinctive change of a living creature like plasticine. But now this ball-like form was gradually transforming into another form. It was as if the living creature had cultivated into a monster and was gradually taking human form. The difference between these two changes was like heaven and earth. Before cultivating into a demon, no matter what changes occurred under the control of instincts, there wouldn't be the slightest change to its essence. A creature would still be a creature, and the limit of its ability would still be at that level. But after cultivating into a demon and beginning to transform, the difference between before and after the transformation was like heaven and earth. Before the transformation, it was just an animal, and after the transformation, it was already a demon. Before the transformation, this creature's level had only reached this level, but after the transformation, it immediately leaped to another level. Luo Fan's concept of existence was constantly changing. When the Dharma power of laws extracted the concept fragments contained in the lightning dragon that belonged to him, his concept of existence had completely changed from its original spherical form to a human form that looked no different from his body in reality, or rather, the form that belonged to him, the form of his innate Taoist aptitude. It was as if his body in the real world had passed through layers of obstacles and directly entered this conceptual plane. After this body was formed, there was a dazed smile on his face. It was as if he had suddenly comprehended some unimaginable truth, and now, he even felt like he was in a dream. With this smile, he gently raised his hand, and those tiny concept fragments directly entered his body. They flowed up and down his body along with the flow of the Dharma power of laws that was being generated in his body. Bit by bit, they were separated and gradually integrated into his body, causing his body, which was already extremely powerful and extremely real, to become even more powerful and real. At this moment, countless terrifying creatures were born in the surrounding sea of lightning again. Chapter 2025. In the face of these countless attacks, the concept of existence that had successfully taken form trembled. He raised his hand and grabbed, and a copper mirror appeared in his hand. After the copper mirror appeared, it exuded an aura that could suppress everything. Under the presence of the copper mirror, the surrounding sea of lightning seemed to be suppressed by an invisible hand. The chaos that was originally chaotic instantly calmed down, and the countless lightning beasts were directly frozen in the sea of lightning, unable to move. Immediately after, mysterious light shone from the copper mirror. With a sweep, the attacks from the countless lightning beasts in the surroundings instantly collapsed. Then, it was the lightning beasts themselves. Bit by bit, fragments of the concept of existence continuously emerged from the collapsed lightning beasts. They constantly condensed towards Luo Fan and gradually fused into his body. It's still a little lacking. After fusing the fragments of the concept of existence that belonged to him from the surrounding lightning beasts, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, he did not hesitate to turn the copper mirror in his hand. The mysterious light began to change, pouncing towards the surrounding sea of lightning. It began to directly affect the sea of lightning itself, and it began to evaporate the sea of lightning. The endless lightning within the sea of lightning had no ability to resist the mysterious light at all. Like snow meeting the sun, it rapidly melted, and it continuously transformed into its foundation at an unimaginable speed, which was the various concepts. Then, the concepts collapsed, and the concept of existence that belonged to Luo Fan continuously emerged. They condensed towards him. Bit by bit, the concept fragments swept towards Luo Fan's concept of existence like a fog, and were constantly swept up by his power of laws and fused into his body. They enriched his extremely empty concept of existence, and did their best to make up for the lack of the concept of existence. At a certain moment, when Luo Fan's concept of existence finally broke through a certain boundary due to the fusion of the concept fragments, a strange wave was transmitted from this concept of existence. This wave was so mysterious that it instantly spread to the concept level of this area, covering all the concepts of existence in this area. It did not delve deep into it. It resonated strongly with a certain part of those concepts of existence. Amidst the resonance, those concepts continued to collapse, and the complete concept split into countless concept fragments at an unimaginable speed. In the blink of an eye, the entire concept level seemed to have turned into a boundless fog. Immediately after, the bodies formed by Luo Fan's concept of existence opened their mouths and inhaled. A terrifying suction force came out of their mouths and acted on the surrounding fog. Under this suction force, most of the mist did not change. It did not even tremble, but the remaining small portion was like a moth flying into a flame, rushing straight towards his mouth without any regard for anything else. It converged in a frenzy, constantly circulating around his body along with the power of laws at the conceptual level in his body. It gradually fused with his body. This process developed extremely quickly. In just a few breaths, all the changes had completely calmed down. At this moment, Luo Fan's body on the conceptual level already gave off a perfect and complete charm. He quietly stood there, as if a boundless world was occupying this place. The copper mirror in his hand also gave off a feeling of eternity and indestructibility. At this time, there was a kind of eternal and indestructible charm. It was as if the half-step primordial origin spirit treasure had crossed the barrier of reality and truly appeared on the conceptual level. I've finally completely returned. At this moment, Luo Fan gradually opened his eyes. There was a strange expression in his eyes, and there was an indescribable joy in his expression. At this moment, he was the real Luo Fan. Although he had already awakened a bit of his consciousness and could think in his own way, display his cultivation realm, and display all of his power, it was still just a bit of his consciousness. It was not the real him. Only now that all the fragments of his concept of existence had returned, without missing a single thing. His concept of existence had become perfect once more. Only then was he the real him. At this moment, in the real level, the world that had originally reached the level of a great world had turned into a fog that could not be described with words. This fog did not have the distinction of clear and turbid air, nor did it have the distinction of time and space. There were no rules or laws to determine order. There was only a simple fog, a fog that repelled everything else. The reason for this was none other than the fact that the concept of existence in this world should have been shattered on the conceptual level, turned into fragments, and turned into fog. In the real world, a world could display all sorts of strange forms, terrains, four basic existences and laws. This was because of all sorts of extremely complicated and mysterious reasons. However, on a conceptual level, it was completely different. On a conceptual level, the reason why this world was like this was because the concept of existence of everything was like this. It was because the concept of existence of everything was different, which caused the scene reflected on the real level to become like this. Under such circumstances, all the concepts of existence on the conceptual level were shattered, causing all the concepts of existence to turn into such a smoky state. Naturally, all existences would be completely confused, causing all existences to lose their forms. Because of that, this part of the world would naturally become like this. It could even be said that the reason why this world still existed and did not completely disappear was because the concept of existence did not disappear on a conceptual level. It was just that the original complete state had turned into this fragmented state. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. In the real level, in the fog, a figure began to gradually take shape. This figure seemed to have walked out from the conceptual level. It was almost no different from the figure on the conceptual level. Obviously, this was Luo Fan's body. After this body was formed, countless specks of light gathered from all directions and poured into his body. Although each dot of light was extremely dim, there were simply too many of them. With so many light spots and such a fast speed, if they were to completely condense together, they could even turn into the sun and dissolve everything. But, as the light spots integrated into his body, Luo Fan did not feel any pressure. Instead, he felt an indescribable satisfaction from the bottom of his heart. When the light spots completely condensed, he waved his hand and the bronze mirror appeared in his hand, which was the half-step spirit treasure. At the same time, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light that was like a group of worlds in his body had reappeared. It looked as if his body had never been lost. Even the countless worlds inside and Sky Maiden who was cultivating in seclusion in the spiritual light did not feel anything, to them. The spiritual light had always been like this. It might not have even moved, let alone disintegrated. Because of this, Sky Maiden could calmly cultivate in seclusion in the group of worlds. If she had known how wonderful Luo Fan's experience was, she would not have let it go. Opening his eyes and looking at the boundless fog around him, Luo Fan frowned slightly. This tribulation. It was not over. The moment he saw the surrounding fog, he was already certain of this point. After all, if the tribulation was over, the surrounding fog would definitely dissipate and he would definitely return to the Tao Master Path. At that moment, the surrounding fog began to churn. Clear and turbid qi began to separate from the fog. Moreover, they began to continuously condense, gradually turning into clear qi and turbid qi. The same change occurred on the concept level. The countless fragments of the concept of existence kept converging and finally turned into two huge concepts of existence that filled all the areas he saw. Obviously, that was the concept of existence of clear qi and turbid qi. At this moment, Luo Fan's concept of existence, that was, the concept of existence that had turned into his body, was sandwiched between the two huge concepts of existence. It was as if heaven and earth were in contact, and he was between heaven and earth. With this change, indescribable power directly oppressed Luo Fan's body, be it in reality or on the concept level. This power was so mysterious and incredible. It didn't just oppress him, it didn't just make him feel that powerful pressure. It was just like the punch he had encountered before. It wanted to decompose him into clear and turbid qi. It wanted to decompose his concept of existence into clear and turbid qi. That punch is still working now. At this moment, Luo Fan had a realization in his heart. The situation in front of him was definitely not a change without a reason. This was the effect of the power of the punch that had descended from the sky back then. Although billions of trillions of years had passed in this great calamity, such a time clearly wasn't enough to completely wear down the power of that punch. I'm no longer the same as I was in the past. At this time, Luo Fan let out such a roar. With a move of his heart, infinite magical power of laws gushed out crazily, condensing into a mysterious light that began to spin frantically around him, producing an incomparably powerful defensive force to resist the powerful attacks coming from all directions. This scene didn't only happen in reality, but also in the concept level. Because he had comprehended the change of form on the concept level, Luo Fan's worldview had undergone an inexplicable transformation, and it was no longer the same as before. Therefore, the law power that was completely derived from law power had also undergone a transformation. He could finally come into contact with the surrounding power that wanted to disintegrate him into clear qi and turbid qi. It was no longer as untouchable as before. For a time, the sound of gaga gaga could be heard, whether it was on the conceptual level or on the physical level. The vortex formed by the mysterious light around Luo Fan's body was constantly being squeezed by an invisible power, and then constantly twisted and deformed. The gaga gaga sound was constantly being emitted during this process. At the same time, blood kept seeping out of Luo Fan's body, no matter which level he was on. His entire body began to twist continuously, and it was almost difficult for him to maintain the form of a born Taoism aptitude. This isn't enough. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he turned his gaze to his origin of life, which was the materialization of the concept of law there. The starry ball seemed to be under indescribable pressure and began to squirm continuously. It was difficult for it to maintain its original stability. As he watched the changes in the ball, he knew that it was impossible not to change. A thought flashed across his mind. Let's give it a try. Immediately after that, his mind abruptly fused with his origin of life, in other words, his worldview. For a time, he seemed to have transformed into an omniscient and omnipotent supreme existence, as if he understood all the principles in the universe. He understood all the mysteries in his heart. This feeling was enough to make any living creature addicted, but it wasn't enough to make Luo Fan lose his mind. He clearly knew that this feeling was only because the concept of law itself contained the explanation of everything in the universe. The correctness of this completely depended on the accuracy of his concept of law. If he were to really get addicted to it, it would be no different from being deceived by his own lies. Therefore, at this moment, he instantly broke away from this feeling and directly suppressed this omnipotent feeling. Immediately afterward, he took a deep breath. His mind erupted, and his powerful will began to advance into an indescribable realm. It was a wonderful realm that he had reached when he was watching the concept of law take shape. In this realm, his current body, which was the concept of law, began to squirm and gradually change shape. The transformation at this time was obviously completely different from the transformation of concepts that existed on the concept of law before. Although it was difficult to transform concepts on the concept of law back then, it was only difficult to control, and there weren't too many obstacles in itself. However, the transformation now was different. During the transformation, there was an indescribable power that was constantly moving towards the concept of law, distorting it in another direction. This was simply equivalent to dancing on the tip of a knife with shackles on it. How could the difficulty of this be comparable to before? Therefore, he obviously needed to concentrate more energy to maintain this transformation. In the end, he had no choice but to give up on his body on the reality plane. After being invaded by that power, the surrounding vortex gradually collapsed, and the mysterious light within it was quickly decomposed into clear and turbid air, merging into the huge mass of clear and turbid air around him, preparing for the opening of a new world. Immediately afterward, the power that was no longer obstructed by the mysterious light vortex further invaded Luo Fan's body, and it began to gradually decompose and transform his body into clear and turbid air. In the end, all that was left was his worldview, which was still constantly twisting and changing shape within that power. All these changes seemed tragic, but they were all within Luo Fan's control. After all, his body on the reality plane was really nothing to him. As long as his concept of existence on the concept of law was not damaged, he could recover at any time even if his soul was destroyed on the reality plane, and it wouldn't affect him much. Under such circumstances, it was naturally the best choice to give up his body on the reality plane and preserve his concept of existence on the concept of law when he had to gather power. The mysterious light vortex that still existed around the concept of existence that had transformed into his body on the concept of law was the best proof of this. Because he had retracted the energy on his body, the transformation of Luo Fan's concept of law was more resolute and smooth than before. Originally, it might have taken him tens of thousands of years to complete this transformation process, but now, in less than 100 years, his concept of law had already transformed into a human silhouette. Although this human silhouette wasn't very detailed, and it didn't completely transform into the same appearance as Luo Fan's body on the reality plane, it could already be seen that it was Luo Fan's appearance. The moment the similarity between this silhouette and his body broke through a certain limit, countless light spots suddenly shone on his body. The terrifying power that was constantly oppressing him was instantly isolated at this moment, and an indescribable sense of relaxation appeared on this concept of law, as well as in Luo Fan's heart. It seems that this method is really effective. Such a thought emerged in his heart. At this moment, the countless light spots on the human silhouette formed by this concept of law were the light spots that appeared on the surface of the concept of law when it was still in the shape of a sphere. In other words, through various methods, it was determined that this was part of the concept of law that belonged to the perfect world level. However, compared to the past, these light spots were now constantly wandering on the human silhouette. There was an essential difference from the original fixed posture, and it showed a different kind of mystery. If one were to compare these light spots with the innate Tao body, one would know that although these light spots were constantly wandering, the places they were wandering were all the acupuncture points of the innate Tao body. The wandering trajectory of each light spot contained the supreme truth of the universe and some kind of fundamental cultivation mystery. Chapter 2026. In the world view of Luo Fan, who had already turned into a humanoid silhouette, there were countless densely packed light spots that were constantly swimming in a specific posture. This meant that there were countless incomparably mysterious cultivation techniques and cultivation principles that could support any living being to sublimate themselves to the false sage realm, despair realm, or even the supreme emperor realm. Of course, this only meant that these wandering trajectories had this kind of potential. It also required other kinds of opportunities and the living being's own comprehension ability to achieve that kind of cultivation goal. After all, cultivation could not reach the highest level just by relying on cultivation techniques. As these light spots continued to swim, the outline of the human figure began to become more and more detailed. Finally, at a certain moment, when all the light spots swam to a specific position, an indescribable power was released from those viewpoints. It directly washed over the outline of the human figure countless times, dispelling the bits of impurities within it. In the end, the originally rough position was completely turned into a detailed state, causing the outline of the human figure to turn into a truly perfect appearance that was almost identical to his body in the real world. The appearance that belonged to him, the appearance of the innate Tao constitution. The moment the world view of laws took on this appearance, the power of laws began to be released from his body frantically. Compared to the original power of laws, this power of laws was at least 10 times stronger in every aspect. Originally, the mysterious light condensed by his power of laws could not resist the power that was constantly attacking him and trying to turn him into clear and turbid chi. But now, just this power of laws alone was enough to form a certain resistance against that power. Under this power of laws, the power that was originally pouncing over endlessly and trying to completely disintegrate his world view of laws suddenly stopped. At this moment, an indescribable sense of comfort and freedom emerged in Luo Fan's heart. The sense of life and death crisis that was transmitted by the indescribable power around him was instantly reduced by more than half. With this feeling, his heart stirred, and the power of laws began to change rapidly. Specks of indescribable mysterious light appeared under this change and covered the world view of laws. As the barrier formed by the mystic light was formed, the power was completely isolated. However, it still continued to attack the mystic light. He wanted to break through the barrier of the profound light and disintegrate his worldview, but he couldn't break through this barrier no matter what. Success! He muttered in his heart. He no longer hesitated. Countless specks of light suddenly appeared above his concept of existence. The positions of those specks of light were extremely mysterious, and they were exactly the same as the countless specks of light in his world view. Even their trajectories were exactly the same, without the slightest difference. With the appearance of these light spots, Luo Fan suddenly felt an indescribable sense of freedom from the concept of existence. Originally, he clearly felt that he still had a huge hidden potential, but he was unable to use it no matter what. At this moment, the sullen feeling vanished into thin air and was replaced by. It was an indescribable feeling of contentment. At this moment, the law power on the conceptual level began to undergo a qualitative transformation, and its quality began to increase crazily. In just the blink of an eye, it had increased to at least 10 times its original level. As it increased to this level, the resistance made by the concept of existence suddenly began to increase as well. The originally barely holding on was swept away, and was replaced by a relaxed and casual attitude towards the invasion of the countless powers around him. Under the various evolutions of his law power, the various powers kept retreating, allowing him to have a larger and larger area of stability. As for the concept of existence around him, during this process it was gradually brought into his control. It was as if he had reformed his own world. This scene also happened in the real world. In the real world, Luo Fan's body had reappeared, and it looked as if nothing had happened before. His body was still the same as before, and the aura he exuded and the mysterious characteristics he revealed were no different from before at first glance. He was still holding the bronze mirror. It was also as if he would not budge even if the universe was destroyed. An inexplicable mysterious light began to spread from his body and spread in all directions, sweeping more and more of the clear and turbid chi into his control. He was constantly dividing a part of the vast and boundless clear and turbid chi that belonged to him. In other words, he was seizing the clear and turbid chi that originally did not belong to him bit by bit. In the past, that fist would have been able to easily shatter him into a state of clear and turbid chi. No matter how much the quality of his profound light had improved, it would still be no match for him, let alone snatch control of the clear and turbid chi from him. However, it was obvious that the current power was no longer the same as when he had punched down previously. Currently, in this tribulation, it was unknown how many trillions of years had passed. And the world that the power had evolved had already been destroyed once during this process. Under such circumstances, even if the nature of the power was incomparably high and had reached a level that even Luo Fan could not understand, it was impossible for it to remain unscathed. It was impossible for it to still be the same as before. It could be said that the current power was many times weaker than the power that erupted from the fist back then. The quality had also decreased due to the flow of time and the birth and death of the world. It was precisely because of this situation that Luo Fan was able to make use of the improvement of the quality of his law power to produce an effect on these powers, blasting them back. However, the power came from that fist after all. It came from the existence that could easily destroy Luo Fan. Even if the quality had been reduced by so much, even if Luo Fan himself was at least 10 times stronger than before, it was still impossible to completely erase this kind of power and completely control all the clear and turbid chis. When the power was pushed back by the mysterious light transformed from his law power, it was actually the power that was constantly shrinking, constantly changing from its originally loose state to gradually becoming solid. Therefore, the more clear and turbid chi Luo Fan gathered, the higher the quality of the power became. It became more and more difficult for him to resist the power. By the time he had separated nearly 10% of the clear and turbid chi, the quality of its power had finally risen to a point where he could no longer move it. He could no longer separate the clear and turbid chi and make it his own. Both. It formed a stalemate where no one could suppress the other. Everything in reality was a reflection on the conceptual level. At this time, when the clear and turbid chi in reality fell into such a bottleneck, the concept of the existence of the clear and turbid chi on the conceptual level naturally fell into a bottleneck as well. For a moment, Luo Fan understood in his heart. This is already the limit now. The moment he had this epiphany, the clear and turbid chis began to evolve to the next stage. The collision between the two chis began to give birth to the 4 basic existences of time, space, matter, and energy. It also evolved into countless laws that determined the order of these 4 basic existences, and gradually constructed a world. Whether it was the clear and turbid chi on Luo Fan's side or the clear and turbid chi within the scope of the power's control, it was the same whether it was in reality or on the conceptual level. After all, the clear and turbid chi was a state that strongly conflicted with each other. There wouldn't be any problems if they came into contact with each other for a short period of time, but if it was too long, the two would inevitably react and give birth to all kinds of things that should exist in the world. This was something that even the power couldn't change, let alone Luo Fan. Therefore, this stalemate between the clear and turbid chi obviously couldn't last long, but it would definitely be broken after a period of time. It would definitely start to evolve the world. As the world evolved, 2 worlds gradually took shape. On Luo Fan's side, the evolution of the world was like a human figure sitting cross-legged in nothingness. Countless light spots representing countless worlds were scattered all over this human figure. It began to gradually revolve around this human figure in an indescribable manner. In the center of this human figure, Luo Fan's body was like the core of this human figure, also sitting there cross-legged. The 2 human figures, one big and one small, faced each other from a distance, appearing incomparably mysterious, as if it contained some kind of transcendental mystery. The human figure formed by this world was none other than Luo Fan's appearance. Or rather, it was the appearance of the world. In contrast, the other world was very ordinary, but it only had the appearance of a normal world. The sky was round and the earth was square. There was a boundless and vast land, and there was also a boundless and lofty sky, with infinite stars, and a sun and moon that illuminated all things. However, compared to the world that looked like Luo Fan sitting cross-legged in nothingness, its size was more than 100 times larger. The comparison between the two made people suspect that the world that looked like Luo Fan would be crushed by the world in front of him in the next moment. These two worlds continued to evolve, and life was gradually born. Cultivators gradually appeared, and the world of cultivation gradually grew. On one side was a world made up of countless worlds, big and small, while on the other side was an incomparably complete world. The world of cultivation developed by these two sides was naturally different, and each had its own characteristics. The speed of growth of the world of cultivation was naturally different. The large world developed more steadily, constantly advancing step by step. The level of the world of cultivation was also slowly rising bit by bit. It could be expected that the longer time passed, the higher the level of the world of cultivation would grow. At a certain stage, even sages might be born. In contrast, the world that looked like Luo Fan sitting cross-legged in nothingness was different. In this world, all the worlds were separated. Before the world of cultivation developed to a certain level, each world was in a state of independence. Each world of cultivation had its own characteristics, and it also had its own speed of development. Perhaps, in terms of the overall speed of development, there was not much difference between this world and the complete world on the other side. In individual worlds, however, the speed of development of the world of cultivation was obviously completely different. In some worlds, the speed of development of the world of cultivation was much slower than that of the world on the other side, but in other worlds, the development of the world of cultivation was much faster. In this way, when the world that was developing at a faster speed broke through the barrier of the world and truly stepped into the scope of the world, seeing the whole picture of the world that looked like Luo Fan sitting in nothingness would enter the fast lane of development. The first wave of cultivators who rushed out of the barrier of the world began to use tough means to conquer other world. It would begin to use forceful means to conquer other world. Like pulling up seedlings to help them grow, it would promote the world of cultivation in other worlds. In the end, it would lead the entire world of cultivation to rise at a speed that surpassed the past. In the end, it gradually suppressed the world on the other side, which was even larger in size. Vaguely, the resources of the countless worlds began to gradually flow in a certain way, causing the entire world to unknowingly seem to come to life. It should be known that the shape of this world was similar to Luo Fan sitting cross-legged in the void. There were countless worlds. The countless worlds were like the countless acupoints on his body. The flow of resources from the countless worlds was like the silhouette of a person beginning to cultivate. For a time, the resources of the countless worlds began to become more and more pure as they flowed. In the end, they were actually turned into resources that promoted the growth of this world, causing the world to gradually grow at an extremely slow speed. Of course, this slow speed of growth had reached an unimaginable level. Even if it was Luo Fan, if he had not been paying attention, he would not have been able to notice this growth. From this, one could see how slow it was. However, no matter how slow it was, growth was growth. This was simply a transformation of the essence of the world, and it allowed this world to transform from a lifeless state to one that was brimming with vitality. At first, Luo Fan did not notice this change. However, after billions of years, When the world of cultivation in this world finally linked all the worlds together, the speed of the flow of resources had reached a point where it could flow between all the worlds with a single thought. This growth had reached a point where it was visible to the naked eye. However, he did not spend any effort on this. He could already easily notice it. There's actually such an unexpected gain. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan was secretly surprised. As an existence like Luo Fan who explored the essence of cultivation, in the face of this unexpected change, he naturally had to think about the reason behind it. However, since it was an unexpected gain, it was obvious that it would not be so easy to find the root cause. After noticing this change, he spent tens of thousands of years thinking about it, exploring it, and even the instinctive resistance of the two worlds. The cultivation worlds in the two worlds gradually came into contact and began to contradict each other. He did not have the mood to pay attention to the brewing war. However, in the end, he could not figure out the root cause of this change and find the real reason for this change. On this day, Luo Fan sat cross-legged in the center of this world, frowning as he thought to himself, "What is the reason? Why can a change in form produce such an effect of self-evolution?" Under this inexplicable annoyance, he observed the world up and down, inside and outside. Suddenly, he had a flash of inspiration, and a look of realization appeared in his eyes. "I actually forgot this most basic connection." However, he suddenly remembered that the appearance of this world was exactly the same as the form of his worldview. Over the years, although he had been investigating the reason from various angles, he had only been investigating the form of the world, the essence, the route of the flow of resources, and so on. He hadn't spread out from this world, for example, the form of his view of the world, and this was something he should have noticed from the beginning. Although he was secretly dissatisfied with himself for making such a low-level mistake, he did not fall into remorse because of it. Instead, he began to expand from this aspect and began to think about the root cause of the change from this aspect. In fact, this humanoid form was the congenital Taoist body of the Tao Master Great World, the untainted world, and even the Earth universe. However, this did not mean how mysterious this humanoid form was, how many incredible truths it contained, or how many cultivation mysteries it conformed to. It only meant that the creator of these worlds was in this form. In other words, this human form alone was not enough for this world to have such self-evolution and self-improvement characteristics, nor was it enough for his worldview to undergo an earth-shaking change and improve so many times. The reason why his worldview of laws could undergo such a transformation after evolving into the appearance of a born Taoism aptitude was actually very simple. It was because such a change was in line with his soul and his will. It had also truly connected the many bright spots in his worldview of laws, which were the concepts that were definitely at the level of the perfect heaven and earth, into one and formed a whole. The various improvements that occurred after that, and the various sublimations of the power of his worldview, were fundamentally because of all these, because of himself. But it wasn't because this body contained some kind of inconceivable power, or some kind of unimaginable profundity. Chapter 20:27. The reason why this world could be like this was because the shape of this world matched the shape of his worldview of laws. Although this world was evolved from clear and turbid chi, the fundamental rules formed were still in accordance with his worldview of laws and his will. Under such circumstances, all of his profundities were naturally closely related to his worldview of laws. Perhaps this shape and the flow of resources between the countless worlds did not contain any mysteries or unimaginable mysteries. However, because it was no different from the shape of the worldview of laws, the flow of resources and the flow of the many bright spots that faintly coincided with the worldview of laws naturally resonated with his worldview of laws. The two stimulated each other, supported each other, and eventually sublimated and improved together. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible to find the root principle of this world. After understanding all of this, Luo Fan naturally understood what he had to do next. Right now, he was sitting in the center of this world, and this world was completely created according to his will. Under such circumstances, he was equivalent to the will of the heavens and earth of this world. His will was equivalent to the evolution of the laws of this world, and he could change everything in this world. Under such circumstances, it was naturally very simple for him to transmit his thoughts to the cultivators in this world through some kind of hint method. As his thoughts changed, the cultivators who controlled the flow of resources in this world felt waves of enlightenment in their hearts. It was as if they suddenly understood some kind of supreme truth of the world, and they understood what was truly efficient. The flow of resources was more beneficial to the world and the resources themselves. In fact, it could not be said that it was similar. Instead, it was truly and truly comprehending the supreme truth of the world. However, this supreme truth of the world was the supreme truth of the world that Luo Fan had added to this world. After all, his will was equivalent to the will of this world. This world seemed like Luo Fan was sitting cross-legged in the void, and the flow of resources in this world began to change in an instant. This world was simply too vast. Even though the cultivators controlling the flow of resources were extremely fast and their orders were carried out extremely accurately, it had already been over 100 years by the time the flow of resources was completely determined. Until this moment, only now did Luo Fan feel the changes brought about by this change in trajectory. The moment the trajectory was confirmed, he felt an indescribable and strange feeling rise from his heart. In a trance, the entire world seemed to have become his armor, or rather, it had become his other body. With a thought, he suddenly stood up. As he stood up, the huge world began to gradually change from its sitting posture. After more than 100 years, he finally changed from his original posture to the same posture as Luo Fan, the posture of standing up. That's it. It was also because the world was too big that it would take a long time to completely replicate Luo Fan's posture. In fact, when Luo Fan moved, the world was already showing signs of change. As expected, it seems that to fight against that world, I have to completely rely on this. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Although it took him more than 100 years to complete such a simple movement, he did not think that this newly obtained characteristic was useless, nor did he think that it was meaningless. In terms of the world, in the blink of an eye, it was calculated in 100 years' time. There was no difference at all. In terms of more than 100 years' time, completing this movement was almost the same as a person moving faster than the speed of sound, apart from the change in movements that could control the world. There were also other changes in this world. That was, the growth of the entire world was at least 100 times faster than before. Previously, although the growth of this world was already quite fast, it was only at a speed that could be faintly noticed by the naked eye. But now, this change had reached the point where it was practically changing every day. Almost every few days, one would find that the world had grown a lot bigger. This speed of improvement was enough to shock anyone. This was the interior of the great calamity. The nothingness here could bear the existence of the world, but it did not mean that it was really in a state of chaos. In the state of chaos, even the time dimension between any two worlds was completely independent. Any world's destruction or collapse would not affect any other world, even the neighboring world. But in this nothingness, it was completely different. Here, everything could be said to be a part of this nothingness. Any change in any location here would inevitably affect other locations, affecting all other worlds. Not to mention, at this time, the two worlds here were still enemies, so the impact would naturally be even closer. At this time, Luo Fan's side of the world underwent this kind of change. This kind of intense change would naturally cause the other side of the world to react. Suddenly, from the other world that was 100 times larger, a small piece of space-time suddenly broke away from it. Like a huge meteor hammer, It fiercely smashed towards the world that looked like Luo Fan had stood up. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan naturally noticed it in an instant. With a thought, he raised his hand to his waist and clenched his fist, and punched in the direction of that small piece of space-time. Along with his movement, the world also moved. The huge Luo Fan also raised his hand to his waist and clenched his fist, and then punched out again. However, compared to Luo Fan, who was in the center of the world, its movement was many times slower. It took more than 100 years for him to truly throw this fist out and complete the entire movement. Fortunately, Luo Fan was able to equate 100 trillion years with a moment of time. Otherwise, the delay alone would have been enough to make him feel annoyed, however, although the movement was slow. But in terms of the world, it could be said to be extremely fast. When the world in Luo Fan's punch was completed, that piece of space-time had already arrived at the location of the punch. It collided with the punch. For a time, an unimaginable shockwave erupted in all directions from the point of impact. Although it seemed that Luo Fan's movement was just a punch, it was not a simple one. But in reality, his punch contained countless mysteries. In the process of the punch, the resources of the countless worlds in this world gathered towards the fist in an extremely strange manner. It looked like some kind of power in a person's body was condensing on the fist when the punch was thrown. Because of this change, the fist looked like it was only a part of the world, but in reality, it had become many times tougher than before. This, combined with the limitless power gathered in the process of this punch, caused the power of this punch to be thousands of times stronger than a normal punch. Under such circumstances, although the meteor hammer-like spacetime felt much larger than the heaven and earth Luo Fan's entire body, it was still much larger. But it still suddenly collapsed under the punch, turning into endless spacetime, and began to collapse in all directions along with the shockwave produced by the impact. This was the void inside the great calamity, not the true state of chaos. It did not have the absolute ability to corrode and assimilate in the state of chaos, but this did not mean that it was absolutely safe. It did not mean that anything or any living creature could exist in it safely. In fact, this kind of nothingness, it itself possessed incredible destructive power. Any existence, unless they reached a certain level, such as a sage. For example, at the level of Luo Fan, or for the two worlds that had reached the highest level. Otherwise, if they entered this place, they would naturally be corroded by the nothingness, constantly decomposing, and finally completely turning into nothingness, disappearing without a trace. At this time, the countless space-time fragments were showing this process. They could be seen. As the countless space-time fragments continued to disperse into the depths of the nothingness, they themselves were constantly decomposing. They turned into smaller and smaller space-time fragments. In the end, except for a few traces that would take a long time to completely decompose, everything else was decomposed into nothingness, and could no longer be found. Just this collision alone had already caused the nothingness to be in a state of desolation, as if countless battlefields had been ravaged. This scene was even more tragic, and the scale of the countless battles left behind after the sages set up their dojo in this nothingness was also much larger. Compared to the unknown billions of years back then, 100 years was naturally too short to even be mentioned. However, the marks left behind in the past 100 years were much more tragic than the marks left behind in the past billions of years. This kind of contrast showed the difference between the heavens and the earth and cultivators. Even if a cultivator reached the sage realm, he was still a cultivator. Compared to the world, in terms of scale, he was naturally incomparable. Perhaps for cultivators, at least for sage-level cultivators, it was common for them to create or destroy a world. However, it was just like how a construction worker could build a skyscraper and demolish a skyscraper. Could a construction worker be bigger and stronger than a skyscraper? At this moment, in the larger world, a space-time suddenly spread wildly in a location. Like a huge spear, it brazenly stabbed towards the world and Luo Fan. At this time, the space-time that had turned into a spear was not the ordinary space-time from before. Instead, it contained endless runes, endless power, and an unknown number of formations and magic treasures. To be more specific, it was a specially built battle fortress. Obviously, this was specially created by the cultivators in that world after obtaining the will of the heavens. It contained the strongest crystallization of that world's cultivation civilization, and was at least tens of millions of times stronger than the ordinary space-time from before. In the face of such a spear, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed, but he no longer dared to casually throw a punch at it like before. Looking at the momentum of the spear, he raised his hands and circled around an extremely delicate and mysterious trajectory, gently reaching out towards the spear. With Luo Fan's attainments in martial arts, it could be said that he had directly constructed the great way of martial arts. It was very normal. Under such circumstances, using the world and Luo Fan to display martial arts could almost strengthen the power of the world and Luo Fan by tens of thousands of times. Hundreds of thousands of times. At this time, even if the world and Luo Fan gathered all the resources in the most economical way, it would not be able to strengthen his body to the point that it could compare with the spear. But if he used martial arts, he would be able to play with the spear in the palm of his hand. He could even use the power of the spear to attack the opponent. 100 years later, the hands of the world and Luo Fan were already lightly resting on the huge spear. Then, the flow of resources changed, and the spear was twisted and broken by its own strength. The spearhead was directly turned back. Held by the hands, it was fiercely thrust towards the huge world. The volume of the spear occupied about 1/10 of the whole world. In comparison, it was at least 10 times larger than the world and Luo Fan. Luo Fan held the spear and thrust it towards the world. It looked like an ordinary person holding a skyscraper and thrusting it towards a certain place. The scene was extremely shocking. Crack, even in the world, Luo Fan could hear the terrifying sound produced by the collision of the spear and the world. After all, the spear was the crystallization of all the essence of cultivation in the other world. Its hardness was really not something that the world could compare with. It was like a knife cutting through butter. It easily penetrated the other world. In just 100 years, it had brazenly penetrated that world. It caused a huge hole to appear in that world from the beginning to the end. That world began to shake violently at this moment. The space-time, nomological laws, and even the earth in the world began to shake violently. Terrifying disasters appeared in that world one after another. The number of living beings who died began to skyrocket. The legendary Deva decay directly descended on all the cultivators who should have eternal life in that world. It made the whole world seem like it had fallen into the end of the world. It was mentioned before. This spear was already the crystallization of the essence of cultivation in that world. With the ability of that world, it was killing the goose that laid the golden eggs. It would probably only be able to condense another spear in a short period of time. Now that the world had fallen into the end of the world, it was even more impossible to use this method of killing the goose that laid the golden eggs. Therefore, at this moment, facing the world, Luo Fan brandished the spear in his hand. In the next 10,000 years, this world had already been pierced through hundreds of holes from one end to the other. This world finally began to fall into an unstoppable process of collapse. Seeing this, Luo Fan's power penetrated the spear and brazenly detonated all the power contained in it. He directly used the power of all the crystallization of the essence of cultivation in the spear to completely blow up the spear. The terrifying destructive power produced completely exploded in the huge world in front of him without reservation. The terrifying impact finally caused the world that was already in the process of destruction to be unable to retain its whole body that was riddled with holes. It directly collapsed into countless fragments that scattered towards the endless void around it. It began to rapidly assimilate with the void and gradually disappear. Among them, countless fragments flew towards Luo Fan, posing a huge threat to him. Luo Fan had no choice but to control the world. Luo Fan displayed exquisite martial arts methods to directly push the fragments away. Only then did he avoid the regret of not dying in the resistance, and instead being injured at the last moment of success. Fortunately, Luo Fan's attainments in martial arts were sufficiently profound and exquisite. Otherwise, how could he have controlled the heaven and earth Luo Fan to safely protect himself amidst the tragic situation where there were millions upon millions of fragments assaulting him at every moment? I didn't expect that the martial arts that I had casually learned back then would actually be useful at this level. There are really no useless skills, only useless people. Luo Fan, who was controlling this world to display his martial arts, had such a thought flash through his mind. The current him could easily split the sky and earth, and every move he made was enough to evolve countless living beings. He could even use civilization as a move and the world as a weapon. It went without saying how high his level was. In comparison, a cultivation method that mortals used like martial arts simply should not have appeared in his body. Even if it was a martial arts method that had been improved to the point of condensing a great path, however, he never thought that in the end, at this time, he would instead rely on this martial arts method to defeat that almost undefeatable opponent and so easily obtain victory this time. He secretly mocked himself in his heart. However, he suddenly realized that he seemed to have overlooked something. What exactly is it? This method seems a little familiar. Where have I seen it before? He pondered in his heart, and his eyes suddenly became somewhat dazed. He seemed to be recalling his memories, searching for the various images and scenes in the depths of his heart, wanting to find the source of the familiarity. Chapter 2028. A fist that descended from the sky was suddenly flipped out from the depths of his memory. At that time, when the fourth tribulation had just begun, the fist that had descended from the sky and blasted the boundless evil chi into the clear and turbid chi, and even blasted himself into the clear and turbid chi. Wasn't that the same fist that Luo Fan had displayed that day? The reason why Luo Fan only thought of this at this moment and linked the two was because the difference between the two was too great. Back then, he could not see through the mysteries of that fist at all, but its power was so strong that he could not understand it. It was able to easily blast the originally ordinary baleful chi into clear and turbid chi, evolving a boundless world. On the other hand, the martial arts that Luo Fan of the heavens and earth had displayed before were only able to erupt with a power that was 10,000 times greater than his own. Even the essence of the martial arts didn't change. The gap between them was so big that it couldn't be measured. Martial arts. Could it be that martial arts can actually be raised to that level? This was the first time in a long time that Luo Fan was so confused. Although he didn't look down on martial arts techniques, he also thought that there was a limit to them. Even if it could be raised to the innate Grand Luo realm, it would already be considered an earth-shattering cultivation technique. However, he didn't expect that the martial arts technique could actually reach a level that surpassed the true saint realm. How could he not feel confused and puzzled? All sorts of messy thoughts kept appearing in his mind, but they were quickly destroyed by him in the blink of an eye. At this moment, a figure gradually appeared in the surrounding void. The figure was blurry and indistinct. After it appeared in the void, it seemed to be the center of everything that existed or did not exist. It was as if it was the center of everything in the world, the universe, and everything that existed or did not exist. In the blink of an eye, it made everyone ignore its blur. Ignoring the fact that it was faintly discernible and indistinct, he directly focused his senses and his gaze on it. Under such circumstances, the presence of that figure had been strengthened by an unknown number of times. It looked like a world of its own. None of them seemed to be as strong as this figure's presence. The moment this figure appeared, Luo Fan suddenly broke free from his complicated thoughts. His eyes focused and locked onto the figure. When he saw this figure, he felt as if all of his senses had been captured. In his eyes, in his senses, in his heart, there was only this figure left. In a trance, this figure seemed to have grown from a height of less than 10 feet to a height that filled the world. It filled the boundless void around them. A feeling of being incomparably small and weak surfaced in his heart at this moment. Under this feeling, he suddenly realized that if Chun-Shi wanted to annihilate him, it would only take a single thought from Chun-Shi, and Chun-Shi didn't even need to lift a finger. Although his presence was already strong to such an extent, Luo Fan could not see his appearance no matter how hard he looked. Even his body could only be seen as a silhouette. At first glance it was still alright. One could tell that it was a human figure. However, if one wanted to take a closer look, they would have to take a closer look. Then, he would find that he couldn't see clearly and couldn't understand. This clarity and fuzziness were mixed together. They formed an extremely mysterious characteristic, causing Luo Fan to feel a surge of irritation in his heart. Is there someone else walking on this path again? A voice suddenly came from the figure. This voice was extremely strange. It sounded very normal, as if an ordinary person without any extraordinary power would say such a thing normally. However, this voice directly drilled into Luo Fan's ears and into his heart. His body seemed to have been controlled by this voice. It was as if this voice could take his life with just a slight change. His soul also seemed to have lost control of itself at this moment, becoming the vassal of this voice. So strong. At this moment, Luo Fan instantly understood what kind of existence this was. Of course, it wasn't who this figure was, nor was it an existence at what level this figure was. Instead, it was because he knew when this figure had appeared. That's right, this figure was the existence that had blasted out those 2 punches. In other words, it was the owner of those 2 punches. Following this realization, he looked at the figure's fist. The memory of those 2 punches resurfaced at this moment, becoming clearer and more vivid in his eyes. That's right, it's this fist. Recalling that fist, Luo Fan shouted in his heart. This figure was blurry, faintly discernible, and its fist was naturally also blurry, faintly discernible. This seemed to be worlds apart from the fist that descended from the sky in his memory. At the very least, its appearance was completely different. It seemed that it was impossible to confirm that the 2 were the same fist based on this appearance. However, he clearly knew that the fist in his memory was extremely vivid and real. In fact, it was just an illusion. Back then, his worldview of laws was still unable to completely transform into the appearance of his body, causing his cultivation realm to be much weaker than it was now, and his eyesight was also much weaker than it was now. Thus, he was completely awed by the aura emitted by the fist, and even his senses were completely warped. In the end, he was unable to distinguish that the fist was merely an illusion, and he took the fist to be a real, complete fist instead. It was only at this time that his world view of the laws had taken form and brought him a huge boost. It strengthened his cultivation realm and his eyesight. This allowed him to see through the illusion and see the truth. He understood that the fist from before was just an illusion. Immediately after, Luo Fan's thoughts changed. Perhaps what I'm seeing now is also just an illusion, an image that's also quite different from reality. When he thought of this, his expression became one of shock and helplessness. For an existence that he couldn't understand, everything he could see was limited by his cultivation realm and his own world view. He couldn't be sure that what he saw was reality at all. To put it in another way, compared to him back then, the difference between the current him and the previous him was only 50 steps and 100 steps. At this moment, the figure spoke again. Your tribulation used me as a weapon. Then I can't just not make a move. How about this? I'll throw 2 punches. If you can block them, I'll consider it as you've passed this round. Although he couldn't see the figure's face at all, Luo Fan suddenly felt that the person seemed to be smiling. However, at this time, He didn't have any thoughts of investigating this at all. Right now, his heart was filled with vigilance and even fear. In the blink of an eye, he activated his half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure without hesitation. A mysterious light emitted from the copper mirror, instantly covering his body completely. Then, it started to continuously spread in all directions, gradually covering the entire world around Luo Fan. Then, under his control, the world around Luo Fan gradually made a defensive posture, setting up a martial arts posture with the strongest defensive ability that Luo Fan knew. This defensive posture was extremely tasteless, as if it was just crossing his hands in front of his chest. However, in reality, there were countless subtle changes and countless exquisite and strict requirements. If an ordinary person without any extraordinary power could completely master this posture, even if he was at the center of a nuclear explosion, he could still remain unscathed. However, at this time, Luo Fan, who made this posture, didn't feel the slightest sense of security. First of all, it would take Luo Fan at least more than 100 years to truly make this posture. Before this, although the defensive power brought by this posture could appear on his body a little, it was ultimately just a little, not worth mentioning at all. Secondly, the level of the figure in front of him was too high. It was so high that he suspected that the figure was an existence that surpassed the true divine realm. Facing such an existence, even if he had prepared his strongest defense, even if he had seized the power of the world to protect himself, he would not be able to withstand it. He also didn't have the slightest confidence that he could keep himself safe. Under such circumstances, how could he feel any sense of security because of this? The figure seemed to smile again. Then, he slowly threw a punch forward. That punch was very ordinary, so ordinary that it was like a punch thrown by an ordinary person without any extraordinary power. It was just a punch thrown by an ordinary person without any technique to exert his strength. Such an ordinary punch, at this moment, was directly branded in Luo Fan's heart like a deep brand. It kept replaying and repeating in his heart, as if it was going to be repeated until the end of the universe. There's a great mystery in this punch. At this moment, Luo Fan had this kind of understanding in his heart. However, even though he had such an understanding and knew that this punch contained an endless and profound truth, he was unable to comprehend even the slightest bit of this truth. No matter what angle he looked at it from, no matter what method he used to study that punch, he couldn't find any abnormality or find anything special about it. Although he wanted to be completely immersed in this punch and try his best to understand the great mystery contained in it, Luo Fan still knew what the figure had said before. He understood that this punch was used to deal with him. Therefore, at this moment, he used his great willpower to free himself from the influence of this punch. He pulled out all his attention and turned to face the figure, waiting for the power of this punch to explode. However, after waiting for a long time, the power of that punch did not explode in front of him. In the end, he only saw that the figure directly withdrew his fist after throwing that punch. Then, he threw another very ordinary punch. What is this? Seeing this scene, Luo Fan only had a look of bewilderment on his face at this moment. The other party definitely wouldn't throw these two punches for no reason. However, these two punches clearly had no effect. He clearly didn't change at all, nor was he injured at all. Just when he was secretly bewildered, the figure chuckled, and with a slight sway, it became more and more blurry. In the end, after a short while, it had completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared in the first place. After this figure disappeared, the entire void began to tremble slightly and then gradually began to collapse. Then, even heaven and earth, Luo Fan, began to gradually collapse. The originally complete figure gradually collapsed into countless fragments. As the surrounding void collapsed, it began to gradually disappear. This was an absolute process. Even though the power of Luo Fan's half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure still covered Luo Fan during this process, it couldn't affect this process at all. It was as if these mysterious lights didn't exist at all. The entire process of the collapse almost surpassed time. Although he could clearly see the process of the gradual change, when Luo Fan came to his senses, he found that everything had completely collapsed without experiencing any time. And he himself appeared in a strange starry sky. This starry sky was filled with a kind of strange gray gas. All the stars were dotted in this gray gas, shining with incomparably mysterious light. An incomparably rich primal chaos aura seeped out from the grayish gas, causing Luo Fan to feel an irresistible pressure on his body. In a trance, he felt as if he was carrying an unknown number of billions of square worlds on his back. This is the second level of the road to Tao Master? I have passed through the fourth major tribulation? At this time, Luo Fan suddenly came to his senses. As he came to this point, he suddenly understood where the last 2 punches of the figure had gone and what effect they had had. The 2 punches had already surpassed time and space. From the end of the tribulation, they directly crossed the entire tribulation and returned to the time when he had just fallen into the fourth major tribulation. They directly blasted the endless evil Qi and Luo Fan into 2 clear and turbid Qi. They evolved into 2 worlds, and then caused the endless samsara of billions of years in the major tribulation. When thinking of this, Luo Fan's expression became unimaginably shocked. It can actually reverse time and space for billions of years in the major tribulation. Sure enough, the path of cultivation is truly boundless. For Luo Fan, in a world at the level of the vast 1,000 domains, he could still try to reverse time and space with his own power. However, that was also limited. Even with his current strength, he could only play with the time span of a few 100,000 years or a few million years at most. In other words, for Luo Fan in the vast 1,000 world, he might be able to break through time and space and send his power and abilities back hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years. In other words, for Luo Fan in the vast 1,000 world, he might be able to break through time and space and send his power and abilities back hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years. Once the scene shifted from the vast 1,000 world to a higher level world, for example, in the perfect heaven and earth level, not to mention sending his power back hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years. Even if he sent his power back to 2 or 3 days ago, it would probably cause great damage to his vitality. And in the previous major tribulation, it was even able to give birth to a great heaven and earth level world. It went without saying how high its essence was. In there, according to Luo Fan's current cultivation realm, it was impossible to even slightly move the time there, let alone send his power back. Furthermore, that figure was only a small shadow, not even a projection, yet it could easily send the force of his fist into the past billions of years ago. And after arriving there, it directly separated the evil Qi, which was originally the origin of the major tribulation, into clear and turbid Qi and opened up a world. It even ignored Luo Fan's defense and opened up a world for him. This level had obviously far exceeded Luo Fan's imagination. It made him really feel what a real expert was and let him know how small he was. Just as Luo Fan was thinking, suddenly, an indescribable sound came into his ears. This kind of sound was extremely strange. It was like the crashing of the waves, rumbling and rumbling. Thinking back to the news he had heard on the first level of the Tao Master's path, Luo Fan already understood what was going on at this time. Turning his head, he saw in the sky an earth-shattering giant wave pushing toward him with a momentum that could destroy heaven and earth. The giant wave was composed of endless gray airflow, and there were small vortexes inside the airflow, in which there seemed to be countless worlds piled up. Sure enough, it's the star wave. In the face of such a giant wave, Luo Fan just sighed. Then, with a flash, he rushed straight toward the giant wave. The star wave was a natural landscape on the second level of the Tao Master's path. There were endless dangers in the star wave, but also great opportunities. This was because the star wave was completely composed of the chaotic airflow that existed inside the Tao Master's path. Because of the extremely rich chaotic aura, there were countless changes, and it could give birth to endless spacetime, as well as many incredible treasures. Legend had it that there was a cultivator who found the embryo of a big world in it. After that, he integrated it into his body and cultivated it, and finally broke through several levels of the Tao Master's path and stepped into a legendary level, leaving behind only an enviable legend. Of course, this was only a legend, and it was still worth pondering how true it was. However, in addition to this extremely exaggerated legend, there were cultivators who could benefit from the star wave from time to time. This was undoubtedly true. Chapter 2029. The star wave was extremely dangerous for other cultivators at the second level of the Tao Master's path, but that was only for those cultivators. For Luo Fan, the star wave was just a trivial matter. Even if it was dangerous, it would not be fatal. After all, the star wave was aimed at the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path, which was equivalent to a second tribulation cultivator. And Luo Fan had already reached the fourth tribulation, no matter how one looked at it. If he still lost his life in the star wave when he was 2 levels higher than the star wave, then he did not believe that there would be a cultivator who could escape from the star wave since ancient times. It was precisely because of this consideration that he did not hesitate to crash into the star wave. The moment he crashed into the star wave, an indescribably terrifying force rushed towards him and directly blasted his body. It was going to completely detonate all his strength and all the substances attached to his existence. This was the powerful force brought by the star wave itself. Under normal circumstances, just this force alone was enough to completely shatter any second tribulation cultivator. In the face of such a force, Luo Fan only moved his heart and a mysterious power of law rotated around him. The terrifying force was instantly eliminated and turned into a faintly discernible force that pushed his body into the depths of the star wave. The star wave was so huge that each wave contained countless worlds. An existence of Luo Fan's size was extremely insignificant compared to it. When he entered it, he did not even cause the slightest wave before disappearing without a trace. Although the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path was not as lively as the first level, there were also an almost infinite number of cultivators cultivating in it. The area where Luo Fan appeared was also filled with many cultivators. At this moment, there were thousands of cultivators watching the star wave wreak havoc in the distance. Among these cultivators, some were planning to leave this dangerous place to avoid calamity, while others were planning on how to cut into the star wave and enter it to adventure. But, no matter what kind of plan it was, they were all dumbfounded at this moment. For the cultivators who could step into the second level of the Tao Master Path, apart from those who were born and raised here, almost all of them had passed the 129,600 square worlds in the first level of the Tao Master Path. His own experience, cultivation, naturally didn't need to be mentioned. Although this wave of stars was enormous to the point that even the entire world seemed tiny and insignificant before it, everything was clearly visible in their eyes, no matter how small the surface details were. They could all see it clearly. Under such circumstances, the entire process of Luo Fan charging in without any preparation and smashing into the star wave was naturally seen clearly by them. Is he dead? He must be dead. A cultivator murmured. How could there be such a cultivator who would actively seek death? This is the star wave. If you want to take the risk to enter it, you have to prepare tens of thousands of layers of defense, and then cut in from the back or the side. Even if you are strong, you won't be able to survive if you just crash into it like this, right? Another cultivator said in disbelief. Could it be that this person is new and his strength is not enough? Can't he avoid the star wave? Another cultivator guessed. Impossible, I saw it clearly just now, he threw himself in. It seems that he must have encountered something unspeakable, so he wants to die. Another cultivator concluded. The many cultivators were divided into several groups, guessing what Luo Fan was thinking about rushing in like this, causing the surroundings of the star wave to suddenly become a little noisy, almost like a vegetable market. However, they did not waste much time on the matter of Luo Fan rushing in. After all, these cultivators weren't here to discuss this. Soon, they focused their attention on their own plans. The scene fell into silence once again. As for the speculations of the cultivators outside the star wave, Luo Fan naturally didn't care about what they thought. At this time, he was only feeling the various mysterious and wonderful changes that passed by his body. At this time, he seemed to have entered a state of chaos. Everything around him was covered in a grayish haze. Within this grayish haze, there was an indescribable corrosive force coming from all directions, constantly assaulting his body, purifying his strength, and even stirring up his nomological powers. It wanted to break it down and devour it, although the four basic existences of time, space, matter, and energy existed here. They spread around in an extremely chaotic manner, filling up everything within his sensing range. Moving forward in this area was like moving forward in a state of chaos for Luo Fan. Of course, it was only Luo Fan's own feeling that he was moving forward. He didn't know whether he was actually moving forward or not, or whether he was actually moving backward. At this time, the magic power of laws entwined around his body began to undergo an inexplicable change. The way it flowed on the surface of his body gradually changed from simply forming a thin film to covering him. Later, it gradually reconstructed into a very special state. This special state was none other than a humanoid shadow. A humanoid shadow that looked extremely similar to Luo Fan. In fact, in terms of appearance, this shadow could be said to be exactly the same as Luo Fan. The reason why it was said to be extremely similar was because there were bright spots on this humanoid shadow. Each of them looked like the acupoints on the body of a born Taoism aptitude user, but they had essentially different bright spots. After the outline of this humanoid shadow was gradually constructed, Luo Fan seemed to have turned into a supreme existence that could suppress everything. The gray and chaotic environment around him had instantly undergone earth-shattering changes in his eyes. The originally gray and hazy area had turned into an empty void. In this void, there were clusters of stars densely dotted the void. In a trance, he seemed to have returned to the starry sky of the Tao Master Great World. It also felt like he had come to the outside of the star wave and was looking up at the entire second level of the Tao Master Path. Sure enough, after passing through the fourth major tribulation, my realm has made great progress. At this time, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. His heart stirred slightly. He moved toward the nearest star. As his thoughts changed, his figure streaked toward the star at an extremely fast speed. At this time, the feeling of moving forward was already a world of difference from the state of being in a daze before. Previously, even though he was moving forward, he didn't even know if he was moving forward or not. He wasn't sure if he thought he was moving forward, but in fact, he was moving backward. But at this time, the situation had become completely different. At this moment, he clearly felt that he was getting closer to his goal. The feeling of the distance between himself and his goal was gradually shrinking, transforming into an indescribable feeling that was transmitted to his heart. Wisps of strange information were constantly transmitted from the Dharma power of law covering his body, allowing him to clearly sense the countless incredible and mysterious changes that were occurring around his body at this moment. The Dharma power of law covering his body at this time was none other than his worldview of the world. This worldview, after this transformation, its nature had already undergone some extremely subtle changes. It had gradually changed from being passive to being active. In other words, before the transformation, the worldview of the world was like a turtle cover. When it was displayed, it could at most ensure that he would not be injured and that he would remain intact under the impact of the outside world. But now, after the transformation, The worldview of the world had transformed from a turtle cover into a martial arts expert. Not only could it protect himself, but it could also fight for him and shatter all the things and environments that he disliked. At this moment, the environment around the Dharma power of law was being actively changed and shattered by the worldview, turning into an environment that could be understood and controlled by the worldview. This was why the waves of stars in Luo Fan's eyes had undergone such a change. In other words, in fact, the environment that had turned into a void in Luo Fan's eyes was only the environment in his eyes. In fact, the surroundings were still the same as before. It was still gray, still similar to the state of primal chaos. Even the situation in his eyes was the same, so the direction he was moving in was naturally different from what he felt. In his own senses, he was moving in a straight line towards his goal, towards the star that was closest to him. However, in fact, in the eyes of the outside world, his path forward was extremely complicated. Not only did he zigzag here and there, but he would also occasionally go around in circles. He had changed directions several times. The route was so complicated that if it were drawn, it would be enough to make ordinary cultivators unable to bear the complexity and directly faint, and the source of all these changes was the worldview formed by the Dharma power of law around his body, constantly transmitting information to his mind. As Luo Fan sensed all kinds of information, he gained more and more understanding of the worldview in his heart and the chaotic state of the outside world. In a trance, he seemed to understand the various subtle changes in his worldview better. At this moment, the shadow of Luo Fan on the surface of his body gradually began to change slightly. Those light spots seemed to become brighter and brighter. The void that seemed to have been shrouded by a layer of light mist, that is, other areas outside the light spots, seemed to have been gently wiped. The light mist began to gradually dissipate, causing the void to become clearer and clearer. In this situation, it was obvious that Luo Fan had comprehended something in his heart and had unknowingly begun to refine his worldview of law. This worldview of law had obtained great benefits after the change in the last world of the first level of the Tao Master's Road before he entered the fourth tribulation. But at the same time, because of this benefit, it had become a lot more complicated. There were many specious ideas attached to this worldview. It was these thoughts that caused the void, which was supposed to be clear, to become turbid. But now, because of his new understanding of the worldview of law, he had finally comprehended the essence of the worldview of law and began to refine this worldview. Of course, this kind of refining obviously could not be completed in a short period of time. But it still needed time and effort or other means to perfect it. This kind of change at this time could actually be said to be better than nothing. Time passed quickly. In Luo Fan's mind, only a few days had passed. He had already crossed a long distance and arrived in front of the star that was closest to him. This star was a world of its own. One could not see the level of this world at all. It was incomparably harmonious with the surrounding star waves, constantly exchanging matter and power with the surrounding world. Seriously speaking, it could not even be said to be a world of its own. It could only be said to be an island in the star waves. There was only the earth in this world, and the sky was completely gray in the star wave. Between the sky and the earth, due to some kind of fluctuation, there was a void that was propped open, giving birth to the sun, moon, and stars, mountains, rivers, and even everything in the world. With a thought, Luo Fan changed his direction and plunged into this world. With a soft poof, his body penetrated the fluctuation, stepped out of the gray star waves, and plunged into the void between the earth and the sky. When he stepped into it, the perspective in his eyes began to change. In the blink of an eye, the scene that was originally a boundless void in his eyes had turned gray again. The scene that he had seen at the beginning reappeared, and the void between the sky and the earth, which could only be regarded as a little bit in his eyes. However, it suddenly expanded countless times. Originally, it was only a few 100,000 kilometers thick, but it had grown to a thickness that could only be calculated in light years. As for the land that was originally the size of a small planet, it instantly expanded into a boundless expanse that could only be measured in billions of light years. After such a change, the place that was originally like an island had truly turned into an incomparably magnificent world. Seeing the changes in this world, all kinds of enlightenment emerged in Luo Fan's mind. Star Wave's simulation of the primal chaos state wasn't considered much. It could only be considered an extremely shallow simulation. However, such a simulation was clearly able to reveal some of the mysteries of the chaotic state. In this simulation, there was such a huge change in the world, and in the state of chaos, the change would only be greater. From the outside, this part of the world looked so narrow. Didn't this mean that the star waves were saying that the star waves were so small? Looking at heaven and earth from the state of chaos, any perfect heaven and earth, or even the great heaven and earth, was just an insignificant ball of mud, or even a tiny black dot. If one doesn't become a sage, one will always be an ant. Such a realization once again emerged in his mind. He had never felt that even though he had grown to his current level and was able to do all the things that he had previously guessed could only be done by becoming a true sage, he was still just an ant compared to a true sage. As he sighed, he strengthened his will to seek the Tao. With a sway of his body, the world view condensed by the law power around him dispersed, turning back into law power and drilling back into his body. Immediately afterward, his figure slowly descended and soon arrived at the highest peak of this part of the world. This highest peak was almost indomitable. Looking into the distance from here, the entire world was almost instantly imprinted in his eyes. There were also cultivators and the cultivation world in this part of the world. However, perhaps because of the influence of the star waves outside, the level of the cultivation world in this part of the world was not high. In fact, in the entire world, even cultivators who could break through the shackles of life were as rare as phoenix feathers and Qilin horns. Of course, although they could not break through the shackles of life, due to the environment here and the almost unobstructed exchange of matter and energy with the star waves outside, the power that the cultivators in this part of the world could control was quite powerful. The power of the cultivators who could break through the shackles of life was probably comparable to that of a false sage. As for the other cultivators who could not break through the shackles of life, there were quite a few who could compare to a false sage. From a certain point of view, the cultivation world in this part of the world was much more powerful than the other worlds that Luo Fan had experienced. For any world, the highest peak definitely had a special meaning. In other words, Luo Fan's current location was not in a remote place. In this place, there were many living beings that were working hard to climb up the mountain. Some of these creatures were cultivators in this part of the world, and some were just ordinary people. Nearly 2/3 of the mountain was a circle of platforms. The platform was extremely huge, surrounding the highest peak, and there were thousands of sects built on it. Some of these sects were closely related to each other, while some did not. They were independent. Because the mountain was too tall and too big, the upper and lower parts of the platform formed two completely different areas. Although the environment at the bottom was harsh, it was still suitable for cultivators to survive. In fact, due to the harsh environment, it was more suitable for cultivators to survive and cultivate than any other place. Chapter 2030. It was precisely that location that separated the two completely different environments. That was why those sects would build their mountain gates on that circular platform instead of continuing upwards and building them at a higher place, such as the place where Luo Fan was currently standing. At this moment, Luo Fan was standing on the highest peak. He did not conceal his existence. However, at this moment, not a single living being could see or even sense his existence. Luo Fan did not exist in the eyes of the living beings in this world. Even the strongest cultivator didn't have the qualifications to see him. What a powerful space-time, what a harsh law. Luo Fan could not help but sigh in his heart after sensing the various things in this world. Such a world was both a bad thing and a good thing for cultivators. It was a bad thing because of the harsh laws of time and space, which made it extremely difficult for the cultivators in this world to unleash their powerful abilities. In other worlds they could move mountains and drain seas, but here they might only be able to shatter a rock. Not to mention that it was a good thing. Once a cultivator could comprehend a little bit in such a powerful spacetime and harsh rules, he would naturally be able to obtain the same level of comprehension as in other worlds thousands of times, or even billions of times, and obtain growth that the cultivators of other worlds couldn't compare with. It was precisely because of this that so many powerful cultivators could be nurtured, even though it was so difficult for the living beings in this world to break through the shackles of lifespan. If it was according to the normal world, generally speaking, it would take at least hundreds of millions of years for a cultivator to reach the average level of the cultivators of this world. In this part of the world, even those who did not have the talent for cultivation would not be able to cultivate. It would only take a few decades for them to reach the average level. If they were extremely talented, they might be able to complete this transformation in a month or two. It went without saying how great the difference was. Luo Fan was quite interested in how this world was like. After all, this was the first world he'd encountered in the Starwave. It was naturally impossible to directly obtain the general characteristics of the world inside the Starwave. However, through this world, he could gain some understanding of the world inside the Starwave. That was absolutely not a problem. Luo Fan stood on the highest peak of this world. His mind began to gradually merge with this world, using the power of the world itself to sense the various things in this world, and to experience the fundamental differences between this world and other worlds. Even if it was Luo Fan, compared to this world, he seemed extremely small. It was naturally impossible for him to grasp all the mysteries and principles of this world as easily as he did for other worlds. For the current him, the deeper he sensed, the more he would be able to understand the deeper mysteries of this world, and the more he would be able to uncover some of the mysteries that he hadn't discovered before. This world was different from any world he had experienced before. Perhaps it was because of his special relationship with Starwave. The entire world was in an extremely incomplete yet extremely complete state. Everything in the world was constantly exchanging with the starry waves outside. During this process, this world absorbed endless power and mysteries from the star waves in the outside world. At the same time, all kinds of power and mysteries were continuously transmitted to the star waves in the outside world. Under such circumstances, the laws of this world were constantly changing. It could be said that the laws of this instant and the laws of the next instant were completely different to a certain extent. This difference happened at an extremely deep level, but on the surface it strangely maintained a stable state. It was as if the laws of this world had already been divided into two completely independent parts at a certain level. One part was constantly changing and evolving. The other part maintained a fixed state. This kind of state had such an incredible independence from each other, yet they were also closely connected and transformed with each other, forming a strange state that couldn't be described with words. Luo Fan was secretly shocked as he watched this. He only felt that his horizons had been broadened, and he seemed to have a deeper understanding of the world and the laws of the world. At this moment, the starry waves suddenly surged. Suddenly, streaks of blood-red light descended from the sky, falling everywhere in this world. Among them, there was a streak of blood-red light that headed straight for Luo Fan. The blood-red light was extremely profound. When it passed through the outer layer of the world, it was so fast that it surpassed time and space. In a flash, it had already arrived in front of Luo Fan and smashed straight towards his head. However, with such speed, it strangely left a long mark in the air. Anyone, even ordinary living beings, could see the blood-red light clearly. They could even tell where it had landed. Hurry, the blood calamity has already begun. All of you must snatch all the tribulation power as soon as possible. Otherwise, our sect will be reduced to a second-rate sect. The platform below was filled with frenzied shouts. At this moment, Luo Fan was no longer in the mood to care about them. Just as the streak of blood-red light was about to reach his head, it suddenly froze and turned into a small blood-red creature that appeared not far away from his head. This was naturally not a change to the blood-red light itself. This was Luo Fan's method. Under normal circumstances, this blood-colored creature would have crashed straight into Luo Fan's head and directly merged into his body, causing some kind of indescribable change in his body. Just like the other blood-red creatures at this time. Is this the so-called tribulation power? Luo Fan raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. The blood-red creature fell into his hand and began to struggle. This blood-red creature looked like a poisonous dragon. It spiraled and surged in Luo Fan's hand, its claws clawing everywhere. The surrounding space kept distorting, and even the laws of the world kept changing. As a result, all sorts of indescribable phenomena began to gradually appear around the poisonous dragon. However, such changes did not affect Luo Fan at all. His palm was still unharmed as he quietly held the poisonous dragon. No matter how much it struggled, there was no change at all despite the continuous destruction. It was as if the poisonous dragon was just an illusion. Boom, 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 boom in the distance, where the blood-colored light landed, there were shocking explosions that kept ringing out. Amidst the explosions, countless screams, roars, curses, and cries could be heard. They were constantly being transmitted. For ordinary creatures and even ordinary cultivators, such sounds could only be heard when they got close to a certain distance. However, to Luo Fan all the sounds in this world could be heard. As long as he was willing, he could hear them instantly. Such a strange explosion was no exception. Let me see what you are. Luo Fan raised his eyes and scanned the locations of the explosions. He turned his head and focused his gaze on the blood-red poisonous dragon in his hand. Then, with a thought, his powerful perception directly pushed aside all obstacles and brazenly rushed into the poisonous dragon's body. He began to thoroughly investigate the structure of the poisonous dragon from the inside out. He thoroughly investigated the poisonous dragon's memories. However, it was a pity that although he had gained a lot from the structure, he only gained some knowledge. To him, being listed did not bring him any substantial benefit. What he was more concerned about was that there was no memory of the poisonous dragon at all. This poisonous dragon did not have any intelligence at all. It only had one thing: instincts. The instinct to slaughter, the instinct to fight, the instinct to use all sorts of abilities. In other words, if this poisonous dragon entered the body of a living being, it would naturally change the will of that living being, causing that living being to have no other emotions or feelings. All it could think about was slaughter, battle, and constantly using all sorts of abilities. After understanding this, he naturally understood what was going on with the explosions that were happening all over the world. Those were clearly the living beings and cultivators that could not withstand the invasion of creatures similar to the poisonous dragon. They had completely lost their will and began to wantonly destroy and slaughter their surroundings. At this moment, cultivators on the platform that was 2/3 of the height of the mountain began to leave the platform and climb up the mountain. Seeing this, Luo Fan understood what they were doing after thinking for a little bit. It was clear that the cultivators had confirmed that there was a blood-red light. In other words, a tribulation force had landed on this mountain. However, as mentioned before, the environment of this mountain was simply too harsh. Even though these cultivators were extremely powerful existences on the platform, they could not ignore the harsh environment of this mountain. Although they could climb up, their speed was quite average. With the mountain's almost indomitable posture, this 1/3 of the way up was hundreds of thousands of kilometers. It would probably take years to climb up like this. Fortunately, these cultivators clearly knew what the blood tribulation represented, so they had the patience to climb up step by step. In fact, although the cultivators that stayed here were quite powerful, they were not the most powerful group of cultivators among the many cultivation sects on the platform. In fact, their strength could only be considered above average among the cultivators on the platform. The truly powerful cultivators had already accepted the order and scattered in all directions, heading toward the areas where the blood-red light had landed. Blood tribulation, huh? Luo Fan muttered as he looked at the blood-red poisonous dragon in his hand. Then, he slightly circulated his power, and a powerful force crushed the blood-red poisonous dragon. With a soft puff, the blood-red poisonous dragon was completely shattered in an instant. Not even a speck of dust was left behind, and it had already turned into nothingness. At this moment, an indescribable fluctuation began to spread in all directions. This fluctuation was abnormally obscure and mysterious, as if there was some kind of incomparably mysterious vitality hidden within it. What kind of person was Luo Fan? When he discovered something unusual, he naturally could not let these fluctuations leave. With a thought, he raised his hand and grabbed at the air. The countless fluctuations that had scattered in all directions began to condense again. In the blink of an eye, it had already condensed into an egg on his palm. This egg was completely blood-red. There was a weak life force within it. Boundless rules and laws were connected to the egg. Traces of mysteries flowed into the egg and began to resonate with the life force within the egg. With the help of these rules and laws, the egg began to grow. As expected, it's not that easy to deal with. Seeing this, Luo Fan sighed inwardly. This egg was naturally the blood-red poisonous dragon from before. However, compared to the blood-red poisonous dragon, the creature that was brewing inside the egg seemed to have changed. The vitality was becoming denser, and there was a faint feeling of intelligence gradually being born. Ordinary eggs would need at least a few dozen days to hatch. However, this blood-red egg was different. After absorbing the power of the laws in the outside world, the vitality within it began to grow rapidly. Its eggshell began to produce creaking sounds, and it cracked bit by bit. In the end, another blood-red poisonous dragon emerged from within. However, this poisonous dragon was much more immature than before, but its eyes were also much more intelligent. There were traces of intelligence in its killing and fighting instincts. After the poisonous dragon appeared, it began to chew on the eggshell around it. After devouring all of the eggshell, its body grew a lot. After this, it began to coil its body into a strange posture. It opened its mouth and began to absorb the chi of heaven and earth in the outside world, as well as the extremely stable laws. As Yuan Qi and the nomological laws continued to fuse with it, the poisonous dragon began to grow. Its intelligence kept increasing. Seeing this change, Luo Fan had a guess in his heart. With a thought, he exerted more force in his hand. As his strength exploded, he crushed the poisonous dragon once again, causing it to die a violent death. At this moment there was another strange fluctuation that spread in all directions. It was impossible for Luo Fan not to react to such a familiar change. He raised his hand and grabbed. The fluctuation once again condensed in his palm, turning into an egg. Next, it was a continuous cycle. Every time Luo Fan destroyed the blood-red poisonous dragon, it would turn into fluctuation again and spread in all directions. In the end, it was caught by Luo Fan and condensed into an egg. The egg continued to resonate with the laws of heaven and earth. With the help of this resonance, it continued to improve and grow. Finally, at a certain stage, it broke out of the egg and became a living creature again. It was slightly different from the last time. It had become more intelligent and agile. In the end, when the number of times reached 91, the poisonous dragon that was born began to beg for mercy. "Spare me! Spare me!" When those words came out of the poisonous dragon's mouth, Luo Fan knew that the result he had been waiting for had come. As expected, you have been assimilated by this world and become a part of it. You are no longer a robbery power, Luo Fan said calmly. No, I am still a robbery power. However, I am no longer a robbery power that targets this world. Instead, I have become a robbery power that is controlled by this world. The poisonous dragon was already pitch black. When it saw that Luo Fan was no longer acting decisively, it finally had a chance to speak. I see. No wonder they want to capture you. Luo Fan came to a realization. Every world, even in the state of chaos, needed to have robbery power. In the eyes of the heavens and the earth, only when the heavens and the earth had tribulations would the heavens and the earth be able to select the cultivators it wanted and allow them to obtain more accurate growth. In the state of chaos, the existence of robbery power had more uses. For example, it could test the perfect world, or it could test the cultivator. Under such circumstances, it went without saying how precious the robbery power was. After understanding this, he naturally understood why the cultivators in this world were in such a hurry to find the robbery power. They were obviously not looking for the robbery power to take it for themselves. That was impossible. The robbery power that entered this world would definitely be devoured by the world and turned into the robbery power of this world. The only difference was the length of time. The most important reason why they were fighting for the robbery power was to leave a mark on it that belonged to them and their sect. The robbery power was a kind of power that was directly integrated into the robbery power of this world. If the power itself was left with a person's mark or the mark of a certain force, it would naturally be closer to that person or force. If this kind of tribulation power was integrated into the entire tribulation, it would naturally leave traces of that person's or that force's mark on the entire tribulation. No matter how much it was, it would definitely allow that person or force to be taken care of when they encountered the robbery power. For the cultivators in this world, if they wanted to break through the shackles of their lifespan, they had to break through the layers of robbery power. If the robbery power could take care of them, even if it was just a little, it would be enough to greatly increase their chances of breaking through the shackles of their lifespan. Just as Luo Fan was constantly killing the blood-red poisonous dragon and assimilating it into this world, the cultivators who were climbing up from the platform were still climbing. Chapter 2031. Although the creature formed by the robbery power was so fragile in Luo Fan's hands, it was like an ant that he could squash at will. However, that was only because it was Luo Fan who was here. In fact, in terms of real strength, the strength of the creature formed by the robbery power was at least at the Supreme Emperor realm. Moreover, after being annihilated a few times, it had already risen to the level of a first tribulation expert in this world. Such an existence could almost be said to be a crisis that could destroy the world. Just like the other blood-colored creatures that hadn't been caught by Luo Fan at this moment, they hadn't died even once until now. Now, they were still attached to a certain creature, and with the help of that creature's body, they were wantonly killing and destroying everything around them. According to the current situation, this situation would probably last for many years before it ended. In order to kill the robbery power creature, more than half of the cultivators in this world would throw their lives away. Therefore, it was not an exaggeration that many cultivators in this world called the appearance of these scarlet creatures a blood tribulation. Seeing that the robbery power had gradually been injected into the aura of this world and gradually turned into a part of this world, Luo Fan had an inexplicable idea. With this idea in mind, he directly took action. With a thought, his own perception directly sneaked into the scarlet creature's body during the process of reassembling, and directly grasped the little consciousness of this creature that had just been born. At this moment, he suddenly felt that an indescribable existence was connected with the consciousness of this scarlet creature. Shockingly, this existence was none other than the boundless and boundless laws of the outside world, and it contained boundless energy and unimaginable might. This kind of rules of law. For Luo Fan, it was also quite a revelation. However, it was just a revelation. After all, on the first level of the Tao Master, He had already walked through the 129,600 levels, which had reached the level of the great heaven realm. He also had a deep understanding of the rules of law of heaven and earth. Although this world in front of him was mysterious and wonderful, compared to the rules of law of heaven and earth that had reached the level of the great heaven realm, it was still not enough. Therefore, at this moment, the laws of this world that he could sense were clearly dispensable to him. He was obviously not satisfied with this kind of harvest. With a slight thought, he began to follow this feeling and dive deeper. He continued to search for the mysteries that might exist within and that might be able to move him. The connection between this world and the star wave in the outside world was extremely tight. It was incomparably special. At this moment, he continued to explore and dig into the depths of the laws of this world. Unknowingly, he had already arrived at the point of contact between this world and the star wave. He could vaguely sense an existence that was countless times vaster than this world appearing within his senses. The vastness and profoundness of this existence were not something that Luo Fan could explore at this moment. The moment he sensed this existence, he only felt the vastness of it. Profound, endless, immeasurable, all sorts of thoughts. As for the specific mysteries and principles that could benefit him, he had no idea at all. After carefully comprehending for a long time, he could only sigh in the end and gradually break away from this state. Perhaps it's because the robbery power is not enough, Luo Fan thought as he came back to his senses. The robbery power was currently only connected to this world by a little bit. If he followed this little bit to explore the depths of the world, he would be able to come into contact with the star wave, which was extracted from this little bit. Right now, he was unable to comprehend the various aspects of the star wave. Of course, it was because the star wave was too high-end, and he could not sense it at his level. However, more importantly, it was because his contact with the star wave was simply too small. It was so small that it was difficult for him to have a direct understanding of it. Whether this was the main reason or not, as long as there was this possibility, it was worth Luo Fan taking action. Immediately, he sealed the blood-colored robbery power in front of him and sent it into the world within his sleeve. Then, he took a step forward. In a flash, he had already disappeared from the highest peak of this world. When he reappeared, he had already moved through the void and arrived at the place closest to him, where the blood-colored light had landed. As for the ability to move through the void, it was not difficult for him at all. Don't forget, Luo Fan had already passed through the fourth tribulation. His cultivation realm was so high that it had far surpassed the second level of the Tao Master's path. Under such circumstances, the world here was naturally not a secret to him. Perhaps, if he were to compare his cultivation realm with the world, he would not be able to so easily control the rules and principles of this world. However, since this world was on the second level of the Tao Master's path, it was naturally affected by this level of the Tao Master's path. With Luo Fan's cultivation realm, it was naturally enough for him to control it. In other words, at this time, Luo Fan was actually able to control the rules and principles of the world in front of him, just like how he controlled the rules and principles of the world in the first level of the Tao Master's path that had reached the level of the Great Universe. The only difference was that the Tao Master's path at the first level of the Tao Master's path had given him the authority to control the rules and principles of the world, but now he was taking the initiative to seize this authority. Since he could do this, how difficult would it be for him to move through the void? In fact, let alone teleportation, if he wanted to, he could directly change the appearance of the entire world and transform it into a world that he was familiar with. It was not difficult for him to do so. It was only because it was not necessary that he did not do this. It turned out that when Luo Fan first entered this world, it was completely calm. However, at this time, it had already become azure hell. A strong blood-red light directly enveloped the area within a radius of hundreds of thousands of miles. In this area, there was a blood-red creature that was crazily destroying and killing. This blood-red creature looked like a ray of blood-red light, constantly shuttling through the area within a radius of hundreds of thousands of miles, picking out and crushing the tens of millions of living beings that were still left here in a playful manner. Among these tens of millions of living beings, naturally there were many cultivators. These cultivators might not have broken through the shackles of life, and could not obtain longevity. However, their power was really not weak. There were even a few of them who were vaguely close to the false saint realm in terms of power. In other words, they were close to the longevity realm of this world. It was unknown whether it was because they were like this or because they were stimulated by the extremely tragic scene before, but at this time, these cultivators were extremely united. In order to create a little advantage over the blood-red creature, there were countless cases of people abandoning their lives. The sounds of killing shook the heavens and the earth. Strong willpower constantly surged, even distorting the surrounding time and space, causing the weather to change. All of this, it made this area look like an incomparably intense and tragic battlefield. Perhaps, to the living beings in this area, although they were constantly retreating, they could still barely block the blood-red creature. Therefore, they still had some confidence and did not completely collapse. However, in Luo Fan's eyes, what he saw was countless times clearer than what they saw. He could tell at a glance that this blood-red creature was instinctively playing with the many living beings here. He could even see the joy that was revealed in the blood-red creature's heart every time it made some kind of retreat, it seems. After combining with the living beings of this world, they already possess some brutal intelligence. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan already understood. However, thinking about it, it made sense. If any blood-red creature needed to be destroyed so many times like the one in Luo Fan's hand before it could develop intelligence and be gradually assimilated by the world, then the blood calamity this time would definitely be a disaster for this world. It was enough to completely destroy the civilization of this world. Only by combining with living beings like this could it be more influenced by the world. Only then would it not need to kill so many times before it could be assimilated by the world. According to this situation, this creature might only need to die 3 times before it would be completely assimilated by the world and eventually disappear. However, Luo Fan did not come here to see how many heroic deeds there were. He came here to obtain more robbery power. Therefore, at this moment, he did not hesitate and had an idea. He raised his hand and grabbed at the blood-red creature. In the blink of an eye, endless laws quickly solidified. It began to compress madly, directly constructing an incomparably sturdy cage of laws around the blood-colored creature, directly wrapping it within. This cage seemed to be formless and incorporeal, but it was unimaginably stubborn. The blood-red creature in the cage, which had surpassed the speed of light, instantly stopped moving. Its true appearance was completely revealed. It was a humanoid creature. To be more precise, it was a creature that looked like a 15 or 16-year-old young man. If it was not for the dense blood-red color and murderous intent, the young man would look quite handsome. However, at this moment, the young man's eyes shone with blood-red light. His expression was extremely ferocious as blood-red light continuously surged on his body, attacking the cage of laws that had appeared out of thin air. He wanted to break free and continue killing. The cultivators who were doing their best to resist the blood-red creature's attacks were all dumbfounded. They did not know how to react. After fighting with the blood-colored creature for such a long time, they knew very well just how strong it was. With their strength, they would have to thank the heavens if they could just barely fight with it. They would even rejoice that they could survive for a bit longer. Under such circumstances, such a powerful existence had been frozen right in front of them. How could they not be shocked? How could they not be confused? However, Luo Fan did not reveal himself in front of them. At this moment, he just casually pulled, and the young man began to roar crazily. A blood-red light began to gradually separate from the blood-red creature's body. The blood-red light was in the shape of a ferocious three-headed tiger. Compared to the blood-red poisonous dragon that Luo Fan had sent into his universe in the sleeve, it was a different kind of might. Soon, the ferocious three-headed tiger separated from the young man's body. The young man's body lost its support and shook violently. It turned into powder and scattered in all directions, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. This caused the expressions of the surrounding cultivators to fluctuate indeterminately. Roar, roar, roar! The ferocious three-headed tiger roared crazily at this moment, and its body continuously collided with the invisible cage of laws around it. It wanted to break out of this cage and obtain its hard-won freedom. However, it was clear that this cage of laws was formed by Luo Fan's forceful manipulation of the laws of heaven and earth. It was so strong that it was almost as strong as heaven and earth. With the ability of the blood-red creature, breaking it was simply a delusion. In the end, under his control, the blood-red creature flashed and arrived in Luo Fan's hand, disappearing in front of the many cultivators. As the blood-red creature entered his hand, the blood-red light that enveloped the surrounding hundreds of thousands of miles began to gradually dissipate. Not long after, it completely disappeared, and the surrounding hundreds of thousands of miles completely returned to its normal appearance. Or rather, it was a normal color. The devastated battlefield was still there. Wow, Nguyen did not intend to disappear. At this moment, the cage of laws had completely disappeared. The ferocious three-headed tiger fell directly into Luo Fan's hand and turned into a small blood-red light ball. Let me go! Let me go! I want to kill! I want to kill! The ferocious three-headed tiger roared vaguely at this moment. The roars were transmitted into his ears in a strange way. As expected, it has enough intelligence. Thinking to himself, Luo Fan exerted force in his hand. The ferocious three-headed tiger roared and collapsed brazenly, turning into ripples that began to rapidly disperse in all directions. It wanted to escape from Luo Fan's control and find another place to be reborn. However, how could the experienced Luo Fan let it go so easily? With a thought, the suction force skyrocketed, and in an instant, it began to rapidly gather the ripples. In the blink of an eye, it had already condensed into a blood-red egg in the palm of his hand. Then, the laws of heaven and earth resonated with the blood-red egg once again. Gradually, the blood-red tribulation power was assimilated, and more marks were placed in this world, this time. Luo Fan did not wait for the blood-red egg to break out again. Instead, he directly looked at the location of the other blood-red tribulation power. With a manipulation of spacetime, he instantly teleported to that location. Compared to the previous location, this location was just as cruel and tragic, but the performance was somewhat different. Previously, the area within a few 100,000 miles was filled with blood-red light, but this place had a radius of a few 100 million miles. Compared to before, it was countless times wider. Apart from that, the killing in this area was much more straightforward than before. Almost any cultivator who encountered the blood-red creature could not leave alive. They were all wiped out with incomparably decisive methods, leaving nothing behind. Although this style was not as depressing as before, it was even more terrifying. The amount of slaughter that was produced was incomparable to what he had done before. Previously, Luo Fan still had the mood to observe the blood-red creature, but here, he had no interest at all. At this moment, after locking onto the blood-red creature's location, he instantly grabbed at the air and constructed a cage of laws, sealing the blood-red creature. Following that, the blood-red creature's true appearance was completely revealed. This time, the blood-red tribulation power did not possess the cultivators of this world, but the exotic beasts of this world. It was a beast that looked like a lion and a tiger at the same time. This kind of beast was already extremely terrifying to begin with, and it had even reached the pseudo-saint realm. After being possessed by the blood-red tribulation power, its strength had skyrocketed by who knew how many times. Each and every one of their actions had resulted in endless slaughter. As a result, the number of living beings left in this region, which was countless times larger than before, was even less than the number of living beings left in that region. Roar! The blood-red monster roared crazily and did its best to attack the cage of laws around it in an attempt to escape. Unfortunately, all of this was futile against Luo Fan. In the end, under his actions, the blood-colored tribulation power that had fused with the monster's body was gradually extracted. In the blink of an eye, it had completely left the monster, causing the monster's body to lose its support. Like a pile of sand, it started to dissipate bit by bit. Not long after, it had completely disappeared. Compared to the blood-colored tribulation power that had possessed the cultivator's body before, this tribulation power did not gain much intelligence. On the contrary, its instincts had been strengthened in a strange manner, making it seem even more dangerous than before. The creature formed by the blood-red tribulation power looked like a Qilin. It was covered in blood, and it was still struggling within the cage, unwilling to give up. As it rammed against the invisible cage, loud rumbles continuously sounded out. However, not many living beings were able to witness this strange scene. Chapter 2032. Luo Fan naturally did not care about those creatures. At this moment, he only exerted a little force and crushed the crimson Qilin-like creature. The tribulation power within it turned into ripples that spread in all directions before being quickly condensed by him, forming a blood-colored egg in his palm. This blood-colored egg was side by side with the egg in his hand. Both of them were also constantly resonating with the laws of this world, constantly drawing the endless power into their bodies, causing them to continuously grow and transform. However, just when Luo Fan thought this situation would continue as usual, an inexplicable change occurred. As the two blood-colored eggs resonated with the endless laws of the world outside, they gradually connected with each other and began to resonate with each other like never before. This resonance caused the two eggs to unknowingly become synchronized. In fact, the spaces inside the two eggs seemed to gradually communicate with each other in a strange way, finally merging into one. During this process, the two blood-colored creatures that were brewing inside the two blood-colored eggs began to move around inside the two eggs. Wisps of mysterious blood-colored light kept exchanging and communicating with each other, vaguely feeling like they were about to completely fuse. With a thought, the blood-colored creature that he had sealed in the world in the sleeve appeared in his palm. Under his will, it suddenly collapsed. The blood-colored creature turned into ripples and quickly condensed under his control, forming a third blood-colored egg in his palm. Each of the three eggs was not small, at least the size of a basketball. However, the three eggs did not seem crowded at all when they lay on Luo Fan's palm. The size of his palm and the size of the eggs seemed to be in two completely independent spaces. The eggs that seemed impossible to accommodate normally were placed side by side, but they did not seem out of place at all. It even made people feel that even if there were more eggs placed there, it would not be crowded at all. Luo Fan stood there quietly, waiting for the three eggs to begin changing. It was just as he had expected. The three eggs gradually began to resonate. Unknowingly, their internal spaces began to connect together, as if the three spaces had formed a larger space in some special way. At this time, the three creatures were constantly moving between the three spaces. There was an extremely deep connection between them, and strands of blood-red light were constantly being transmitted between the three creatures. I see. As expected, this kind of assimilation isn't that simple. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, the three creatures in the three eggs were communicating with each other in an extremely subtle manner. As they communicated, the three creatures were constantly assimilating and evolving. Vaguely, their connection with this world seemed to be growing closer. If that was all, it was naturally not enough for Luo Fan to have such a performance. More importantly, as they communicated with each other, there seemed to be an existence on a deeper level resonating with these three creatures. This kind of existence was vast and boundless, and possessed an incomparably terrifying might. It contained the characteristics of judging everything, and it was as if the entire world would tremble under its presence. Even he felt a little terrified when facing this kind of existence, combined with the nature of the blood-red creatures. He naturally understood that this existence was none other than the tribulation power of this world. Among them, most of it was naturally present in this world, but a large portion was definitely formed from the tribulation power of the blood tribulation. As this resonance occurred, strands of tribulation power were born. They were absorbed by the tribulation power of this world. While the absorbed tribulation power continuously strengthened the tribulation power of this world, the tribulation power in Luo Fan's hands did not lose much. Instead, it vaguely became more condensed, and its nature was even more sublimated. This situation was almost like tribulation power being born out of thin air. From the looks of it, the longer these tribulation power beings wreak havoc in this world, the greater the benefits they will obtain. In the end, after those cultivators disperse the tribulation power, the authority they will obtain will naturally be even higher. No wonder, he thought to himself. Luo Fan turned his head to look at the powerful cultivators in the distance, who were not in a hurry as they thought about the areas where the blood-red creatures were wreaking havoc. He already understood a lot. However, these things did not mean anything to him at all. He quickly tossed all these thoughts to the back of his mind, and his heart stirred. He had already moved through time and space, heading towards the region where the other blood-colored creatures were wreaking havoc in this world. After those blood-red creatures possessed the creatures of this world, they all underwent all sorts of subtle changes. Their might had become stronger, and their methods had become more numerous. The threat they posed to the creatures of this world had also become greater. However, all of this was nothing to Luo Fan. No matter how much stronger they were, no matter how inconceivable their methods were, to him, it was just a matter of a single slap. Therefore, in just a few dozen breaths, he had already traversed all the battlefields in this world. He had captured all the blood-red creatures and turned them into blood-red eggs that appeared in the palm of his hand. At this moment, the cultivators who truly had the ability to destroy these blood-red creatures were still unhurriedly heading towards the areas where the blood-red creatures were wreaking havoc. They were waiting for the blood-red creatures to kill more and reproduce more, allowing them to obtain more benefit. Dozens of densely packed blood eggs appeared in Luo Fan's palm. Each blood egg was at least the size of a basketball, and the bigger ones were even the size of a planet. However, it was precisely these blood eggs that were lined up side by side under his palm that was less than a foot long that seemed so harmonious. There was not the slightest bit of awkwardness or abruptness, as if the palm itself could accommodate so many things that were far larger than its size. At this moment, the blood-red eggs seemed to have become one. All of the eggs were connected, and the spaces within them were connected to each other. The dozens of blood-red creatures could even move between the spaces within the eggs. It seemed like they had vaguely formed a society. In fact, this was because some of the blood-red creatures had clones or had given birth to other creatures. With the abilities of the other individuals, the number of creatures in the blood-red space was no longer the same as before. Instead, as time passed, more and more of them appeared, gradually forming all sorts of special sceneries. The blood-red space was also unknowingly modified, causing it to gradually turn into a blood-red world. Moreover, it was a blood-red world that was growing wider and wider. This blood-red world contained all sorts of indescribable power that continuously spread in all directions. It was faintly connected to the laws of this world, as well as the tribulation power that was hidden deep within this world. At every moment, boundless tribulation power was released from the blood-red space and transmitted into the tribulation power of this world. The entire process was endless, and it was endless. It was like a spring that was constantly flowing with spring water, causing the tribulation power of this world to grow more and more. Unknowingly, more and more indescribable imprints had gathered within it. It was a kind of imprint that was somewhat similar to Luo Fan's, but there was also an indescribable difference. Under this imprint, Luo Fan could faintly feel that his perception of the tribulation power of this world was becoming clearer and clearer. The existence of the tribulation power was a unique existence that existed in any world. However, this tribulation power was not like what Luo Fan had sensed at this moment. It was like a pile of clouds that existed on a certain level of the world. In fact, ordinary tribulation power was basically divided into endless laws and laws that fused into the laws and laws of the world. In other words, it was like air. It was like salt in the sea. It could even be said that the tribulation power in this world was also formed in the same way. It was also formed by the countless tiny details that could be said to be meaningful. The reason why Luo Fan felt that it had turned into such a cloud-like appearance was very simple. It was because his perception made him think that the tribulation power would take this form. Because he thought it would be like this. From what he could sense, this tribulation power. That was it. This seemed to be a bit idealistic, but it was the truth. At Luo Fan's level, his perception itself already possessed unimaginable power, enough to affect and change everything. Of course, it could also be explained in a less idealistic way. For example, the tribulation power was divided into countless details, and countless parts were scattered into the endless laws and laws of the world, but the tribulation power itself still existed. Luo Fan's current perception was only ignoring the other parts of the laws and laws of the world, and only protruding out the part that belonged to the tribulation power. From the looks of it, the tribulation power was naturally the same as what he had sensed. As the blood-colored creature circulated and established a connection with the tribulation power of the world, Luo Fan felt that the door that had originally only opened a small crack had now completely opened. After passing through the tribulation power of the world, the vast star wave had already appeared in his senses. This is the star wave. Looking at the boundless star wave and feeling the traces of incomprehensible profoundness that belonged to the state of chaos, he suddenly felt an indescribable emotion. This kind of emotion came from the trace of the profoundness that belonged to the state of chaos, from the resonance between his heart and that profound feeling. For the current Luo Fan, truly comprehending the state of chaos and discovering the truth of the state of chaos was no longer an illusion. With his current worldview, even if he truly entered the state of chaos, he would be able to survive for a little longer. Of course, this was calculated using his own senses. For him, who was still unable to transcend the state of chaos, entering the state of chaos was equivalent to turning himself into a part of the state of chaos, causing the time where he was to become incomparably chaotic, and it was impossible to understand it with normal concepts. Given his current situation, he was naturally qualified to explore the various profoundness of the state of chaos. To him, the profoundness of the chaotic state revealed by the star wave was like placing delicious food in front of an incomparably thirsty, hungry man. The feeling it brought to his soul naturally made him feel incomparably fulfilled and satisfied. As a result, an indescribable feeling was born, although he was already qualified to explore the state of chaos. Facing the true profoundness of the state of chaos, he still couldn't easily understand it. At this moment, he was immersed in the profoundness, and his body unknowingly exuded an indescribable charm. It was as if he was gradually leaving this part of the world. Even the traces of his existence began to gradually disappear. It didn't take long for it to reach a point where no cultivator in the world could sense it. At this moment, a blood-colored cloud gradually condensed in the void where he was. This blood-colored cloud transmitted an incomparably strong aura of judgment and punishment. As soon as it appeared, it seemed to have completely changed the surrounding space within millions of miles. Even the laws seemed to have undergone a subtle change, going from extremely stable to extremely active. countless strange sceneries filled the area within millions of miles of this change. This change shocked many cultivators in this part of the world. Combined with the area where the blood-colored creatures were wreaking havoc strangely calmed down, they all suddenly understood that this blood calamity would be different from any previous one. When they understood this, all of them were horrified, and they converged towards this area of a few million kilometers from all directions at a speed that was countless times faster than before. In a short period of a few days, they'd completely surrounded this area. How can this robbery power appear? Could it be that we have gone too far and the heavens are now punishing us? A cultivator muttered. His words caused the expressions of the other cultivators to turn ugly. I can sense that our sex brand is being worn away, a cultivator said with an ugly expression. This was the benefit he obtained from the previous blood calamity. The sect that had imprinted its own sex brand into the tribulation power. It's the same for us. If this continues, it won't be long before we lose our lives. We'll be no different from other cultivators. Another cultivator said with an ugly expression. Break this robbery power. All of these changes must be because of the tribulation power. As long as we shatter it, everything will return. A reckless cultivator shouted. However, this kind of cheering didn't get many echoes. The cultivators here dared to plot against the heavens and earth, so how could they be brainless? The losses they had suffered now seemed to be the manifestation of the robbery power, but how could they know the truth now? What if the manifestation of the tribulation power was not the cause, but the effect? If that was the case, all of their efforts would be for naught and would be a waste of precious time. Wouldn't they be unable to cry even if they wanted to? The root cause must be the blood calamity. Who took the robbery power? Are you still not willing to stand up? A highly respected cultivator said coldly. A cultivator that had obtained eternal life and was considered one of the strongest in the heavens and earth spoke coldly. His voice spread far and wide. All of the cultivators within a radius of several million miles could hear his voice clearly. His words seemed to have turned on a switch, causing all the cultivators to become noisy. All of them were shouting, wanting the cultivator who took all the tribulation power creatures to come out and give them an explanation. Clearly, almost all the cultivators believed that someone else had broken the rules. Someone else had taken the initiative to take away all the tribulation power beings while they were allowing the tribulation power beings to wreak havoc. That was why the tribulation power beings had disappeared. That was why this unbearable change had occurred. As for how cultivators were able to snatch away tribulation power beings, they were not surprised at all. The history of the cultivation world of this world was extremely long. Since ancient times until now, how many astounding and brilliant cultivators had appeared, and how many unimaginably profound divine abilities had been created. Who knew all of this? Who knew when someone would create a divine ability that specialized in collecting tribulation power creatures, or create a magic treasure that specialized in dealing with tribulation power creatures? Naturally, these shouts would not receive any response. After all, the one who did all of this wasn't any of the cultivators, it was Luo Fan. The cultivators didn't know any of this. At this moment, there was only one thought in their minds, and that was that the cultivator who did all of this was selfish and didn't care about the big picture at all. Even at a time like this, he wasn't willing to give up his own benefits. At this moment, the seeds of suspicion began to sprout. Some cultivators pointed at another cultivator and shouted, "It must be you! You always said that you wanted to take more robbery power, you must be the one who did this. Hurry up and hand over the robbery power." The cultivator that was pointed at was naturally unwilling. He angrily said that the other party was a thief who was trying to catch a thief. As the argument grew more and more intense, it was natural for the cultivators to fight. Chapter 2033. Luo Fan naturally didn't care about the slaughter around the area enveloped by tribulation energy. At this moment, He'd fallen into that trace of profound comprehension towards the chaotic state, and he couldn't sense anything that was happening in the outside world or even what was happening to himself. There was no time, space, matter, or energy in the state of chaos. There was endless time, space, matter, and energy. The entire state of chaos was different from any other world. It could even be said that it was completely different from Luo Fan's understanding, no matter what level he reached, no matter how deep his understanding of the state of chaos was. When his cultivation realm improved and his strength increased, he would discover that there were too many loopholes in his previous understanding. It could even be said that they were all wrong. Under such circumstances, it was also difficult for Luo Fan to comprehend the profundities of the state of chaos. At this moment, he felt that some concepts and profundities in his world view of laws seemed to be in line with this profundity. It made him feel as if he had grasped the truth and the essence of chaos. However, in the next moment, he realized that he had overlooked an extremely crucial point in his previous comprehension. If this crucial point was added, then the situation would be completely different. In fact, it could even be said to be a complete reversal of the original situation. Just like that, Luo Fan was subverting his own views and constantly reconstructing his view of the world. In this way, the world view that had been formed in his body was constantly distorting. There seemed to be a faint mist appearing on the surface of his body, causing anyone who looked at him to feel as if their worldview had become blurry. Luo Fan naturally didn't feel good about these changes. However, he didn't feel discouraged at all. On the contrary, he was filled with boundless fighting spirit. He tried his best to control his world view of the laws, and tried his best to integrate the mysteries of the chaotic state contained in the star waves that he had comprehended through the tribulation power lifeform connection into his world view of the laws. This was clearly not a process that could be completed in a short period of time. In fact, it could even be said to be an impossible task. Luo Fan was well aware of this. However, even though he knew this, he did not give up. Of course, this was not because he was stubborn, but because he could clearly feel it. This process was actually a tempering of his worldview. Every time he rejected his previous comprehension, it was equivalent to removing a bit of impurities from his worldview. Every time he confirmed a common point in his previous comprehension, it was equivalent to confirming the authenticity of a certain concept in his worldview. In this way, when combined with the perfect world template of the half-step primordial origin spirit treasure, he was able to add more and more bright spots to his worldview, making the bright spots that originally existed on him grow brighter and brighter. In this way, for him, this kind of cultivation was actually the most fundamental cultivation. The longer he persisted, the more powerful he would become. How could he be discouraged? The more he could improve his cultivation realm, the more he would be able to improve. How could he give up on this cultivation method just because the final result was impossible? As he experienced it, the worldview that he had completed in the last world of the first level of the Tao Master's path gradually collapsed. Wisps of the concept of the world of laws that did not belong to the perfect world were gradually stripped away, separated from his body, and began to gather around his body. In Luo Fan's own view, these concepts that were stripped away were impurities in his worldview, but that was only compared to the perfect worldview. In fact, each of these concepts could be said to be the truth of heaven and earth, and each point was enough to be the general outline of any supreme cultivation book. Such concept fragments continued to gather around his body, but unknowingly, the endless world essence chi around him and the endless rules and laws around him naturally attached to him. They naturally fused together. In this way, the space-time around Luo Fan, who was originally completely hidden in this side of the world, began to gradually distort. Unknowingly, his appearance had changed. In the distortion of space-time, countless strange lights and shadows kept appearing within it. An indescribable attractive force began to appear from these distorted space-time. These attractive forces were so mysterious that they did not target any physical matter, but the most intense existence in this area at this time, the tribulation power. Under this attractive force, the first to be affected was not the tribulation power creatures in Luo Fan's hands, but the tribulation power that appeared in the void that belonged to this side of the world. In the blink of an eye, a vortex suddenly appeared in the blood-red clouds in the sky. After this vortex appeared, it began to bulge downwards, and then a huge tornado rushed straight down from the blood-red clouds, brazenly pouring into the distorted space-time around Luo Fan's body. The tribulation power was actually not a real power. In essence, there was no such power as the tribulation power between heaven and earth. The reason why there were tribulation power creatures in this side of the world, and the tribulation power of this side of the world would appear, was because the laws of this side of the world were extremely special, and naturally the invisible concept of judgment, punishment, and test of the world would appear. In other words, the tribulation power was actually the invisible concept of judgment, punishment, and test. In this way, the existence that appeared in this side of the world, that transcended the control of this side of the world, was naturally the greatest provocation to the tribulation power. If it was an existence like Luo Fan, it would naturally not matter. He had already formed his own body, and even in the chaotic state, he could protect himself for a period of time. Any changes in this side of the world were naturally not enough to affect him. Naturally, the tribulation power would not be able to attack him. However, there was no existence with intelligence, such as the concept impurities around Luo Fan, that had been removed from the world of laws at this moment, and they would not be so lucky. Although these concept impurities were incompatible with the world of laws at the level of perfect heaven and earth, they still had traces of the characteristics of the world of laws. There was an essential difference with the fundamental world of this side of the world. Such an existence could even be called the enemy of heaven and earth. Once they entered this side of the world, there was no hiding. Naturally, they would be greatly rejected by this side of the world. If the invisible concept of judgment, punishment, and test of the world could not appear, this kind of rejection would only be rejection. At most, there would be some special changes that would cause the aggregation of the concept impurities to become unlucky, and it would only be half the result with twice the effort to achieve any goal. Once the invisible concept of this side of the world appeared, the situation would obviously be completely different. After the invisible concept appeared, it would have the characteristics of a physical power, and it would naturally gather towards the place where it would be effective, and the final result was this. It began to pour down, quickly pouncing towards the distorted space-time that was gathered by the countless world impurities around Luo Fan's body. In fact, the attractive force that appeared before the distorted space-time could be said to not exist. It was actually just because the world hated and rejected the aggregation of the world impurities. It was as if the invisible concept had appeared as tribulation power. Looking back a little further, the tribulation power of this side of the world began to continuously gather above Luo Fan's head, separating this area from the outside world. In fact, it was precisely because Luo Fan's world of laws began to change that a trace of aura was revealed, and was sensed by this side of the world. The tribulation power continued to gather into the distorted space-time and began to merge with the many concepts in the space-time, producing all kinds of incomparably intense changes. There were even more incomparably rich changes. The distorted space-time began to gradually split apart. Different parts of the world were gradually formed within the distorted space-time. As more and more tribulation power surged in, more and more tribulation power appeared. As the amount of tribulation power poured in, more and more worlds were divided in the distorted space-time. In just a few dozen breaths, there were already hundreds of millions of worlds densely surrounding Luo Fan's body, making Luo Fan look like the center of countless worlds, as if countless worlds were revolving around him. After these worlds were formed, countless ugly, beautiful, kind, muddle-headed, stupid, or smart creatures were born in these worlds. After these creatures were born, then it began to fight against the other creatures in a frenzy. During the fight, they stimulated supreme destructive power, destroying the world one after another. At the same time, as the tribulation power poured in, another world was born because of the combination of the concepts and tribulation power, forming an extremely fast scene of life and death. From afar, it looked like countless stars were constantly flickering around Luofan's body, as if there were eyes constantly blinking. The range of the distorted space-time continued to expand as the concept impurities Luofan eliminated increased. At first, it was only a few dozen feet in radius, but after a few dozen breaths, it had expanded to several miles in radius. Several hours later, the area within a radius of several million miles was completely filled with it. This range was exactly the same as the range of the tribulation clouds above. At this point, no matter how angry the surrounding creatures were, no matter how blinded by the slaughter, it was impossible for them not to notice it. As they noticed this, more and more creatures felt that something was wrong. Unknowingly, they gradually stopped fighting. In the end, after a few days, the fierce fighting in the surroundings completely stopped. All the creatures looked at the changes in the space-time within the range of the tribulation power with complicated gazes. To be more specific, they were watching the birth and death of countless worlds. This scene of the birth and death of worlds was an unprecedented wonder for the cultivators in this world. After all, because the cultivators in this world were shackled by this world, it was countless times more difficult for them to break through their lifespan than the other worlds that Luofan had experienced. In other words, if any creature could not break through and obtain longevity in an extremely short period of time, then in the end, no matter how powerful their god arts were, they would turn into a pile of bones. They would all turn into a pile of bones. Everything was wonderful and wonderful. Everything would become nothing. Under such circumstances, which cultivator would have so much time to study all kinds of god arts that required a large amount of time to cultivate? Why would any cultivator open up a world that was not very beneficial for them to obtain longevity? Therefore, although their cultivation level was not too bad, and the strongest was even at the false sage stage, the cultivators in this world were still at an extremely low level in their study of the world and their understanding of the creation of heaven and earth. If they were asked to open up a space that could be used for storage or to nurture spirit beasts and spirit plants, it would naturally not be a problem. However, to open up a world that could give birth to creatures and give birth to a cultivation civilization, that was obviously impossible. As a result, when these cultivators saw the countless worlds being born and destroyed at every moment, with countless creatures being born, reproducing, killing, and dying in each world, it was easy to imagine how shocked they were. If they could still maintain their previous killing intent after seeing such a scene and still fight with other cultivators without caring about anything, then their realms would not be the same as they were now. However, even though they had only been fighting for a few days, due to the intensity of the battle, the number of cultivators who had died at this time, however, it was already more than 30% of the total. The dark bloodstains had already completely changed the color of the land within a radius of thousands of kilometers, and the smell of blood lingered. The scene was extremely tragic. The cruelty of it was truly shocking to anyone who was clear-headed. So, this is the world. Some cultivators murmured. The power in their bodies began to circulate involuntarily, and it began to flow endlessly according to an indescribable trajectory. Gradually, it released an indescribable aura of life and death. It was as if their entire bodies were unknowingly turning into a world of their own. To cultivators, it was a shock to their souls. It was a source of inspiration. The greater the shock, the greater the possibility of inspiration. The endless worlds before them were constantly being born and destroyed. To these cultivators, it was a shock that toppled their worldview. Facing this shock, even the cultivator with the worst talent would gain some enlightenment. At that moment, 70% to 80% of the cultivators who had gained enlightenment had begun to experience changes in their bodies. However, not every cultivator had gained enlightenment in the aspect of world life and death like this cultivator. Most of the living beings had gained enlightenment in the aspect of slaughter and divine abilities. However, no matter what kind of comprehension it was, in the end, it shook time and space and began to release an indescribable aura. It gradually gathered and formed an indescribable Tao comprehension circle. It formed countless strange phenomena that surrounded the boundary of the tribulation power, separating the inside from the outside world. This Tao comprehension circle was formed by the inspiration of many cultivators, and they entered a state of enlightenment, causing the world to change subtly. It did not have much power by itself, and at most, it could only make it easier for any cultivator who entered this circle to enter a state of enlightenment and gain inspiration. Normally speaking, it would be difficult for such an enlightenment circle to withstand a casual attack from a false saint, let alone stop the spread of the countless worlds inside at this moment. However, since this was said here, it was clear that what was happening was not normal. At this moment, when the enlightenment circle formed, the expansion of the world swarm stopped completely. It was as if the Tao comprehension circle was a strong and unbreakable shackle that completely cut off the path of expansion of the countless worlds. It was also as if this Tao comprehension circle was a huge shackle that completely locked the space-time inside this circle. This situation was indescribably strange and mysterious. However, at this moment, whether it was Luo Fan or the countless cultivators in the Tao comprehension circle, none of them noticed this place. Needless to say, Luo Fan had even forgotten about his own body, so it was naturally impossible for him to sense the various changes that were happening inside this world. Although the cultivators in the Tao comprehension circle did not completely fall into a state where they forgot about themselves like Luo Fan, they were still wholeheartedly comprehending Tao. Even if they sensed the slightest bit of the outside world, they would naturally turn it into resources for comprehending Tao and the source of their inspiration. Under such circumstances, how could they possibly discover that the world within the Tao comprehension circle had suddenly stopped? Because of the shackle of the Tao comprehension circle, the world lost the ability to expand, but it finally stopped the blood-colored cloud formed by the tribulation force and maintained its current size. Otherwise, if the world continued to expand outwards, it would naturally cause the repulsive force of this region to continuously increase. Then, it would cause more and more tribulation power to condense, and in the end, it would naturally cause the tribulation cloud to continue to expand. The result of the expansion of the tribulation cloud was that more tribulation force would fuse into the world impurities, thus giving birth to more and more worlds, causing the world group to expand again, causing the tribulation force to increase again. As a result, a vicious cycle would be established. In the end, it would definitely reach a point where the world group could not withstand it. In other words, the entire world would be completely covered by the tribulation cloud,